Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Extended Day-Ahead Market Technical Workshop, where we'll be discussing various elements of the Day-Ahead Resource Sufficiency Evaluation. My name is Isabella Nicosia, representing ISO Stakeholder Affairs, and I'll be facilitating the meeting today. The presentation is available out on the CAISO website on the Extended Day-Ahead Market Initiative webpage, and you can navigate to that page by going to CAISO.com. Stay informed, and then you'll go to policy initiatives and find the Edam webpage on that main landing page. Before we get started today, I'd like to go over a few meeting reminders and housekeeping slides. So today's workshop is designed to stimulate an open dialogue and leverage different perspectives with the goal of really designing solutions to outstanding Edam design issues. And this call and workshop is being recorded for informational and convenience purposes only, so any related transcription should not be reprinted without the ISO's permission. If you need technical assistance at any time during the meeting for our virtual audience, you can send a chat to the event producer. Her name is Shreyas. And thank you for joining us, and we look forward to an engaging discussion today. We will be taking questions throughout the meeting. So for our in-person attendees, you'll just want to raise your hand. We have a few wireless mics that will be running around during Q&A. So once you raise your hand, just wait for a mic to reach you, and then go ahead and introduce yourself and your organization, and then ask your question so that our virtual attendees can hear you. And then for our virtual attendees, please raise your hand using the raise hand feature in Zoom, or you can submit a question through the chat. We'll have someone monitoring that today as well. And again, please make sure to state your name and organization when asking your question. See, the agenda for today, we'll start off with welcome and some opening remarks, and then move into the content. So we'll start off with transmission constraints in the Edam RSE, and that'll take us to our break at about 2:30. And then in the second half of today's meeting, we'll go over the Edam treatment of Wspp Schedule C contracts, and then wrap up with some next steps and closing remarks. And then we are holding a networking reception after today's workshop here at the Marriott from 5:30 to 7. So welcome you to join us for that as well. And then tomorrow we'll have an early morning start. So continental breakfast will actually be offered here. We'll have that served in this room over to your left. And then we'll start the meeting at 8 and do some welcome opening remarks, and then move into the content. So we'll cover the Edam RSE counting of intertie bids at the CAISO border. We'll take a break in the morning. We'll have some snacks, and then go into the Edam failure consequences topic, break for lunch, and then wrap up tomorrow's workshop with pooled WEIM RSE approach, and then go over some next steps and closing remarks. So with that, I will hand it over to Milos Bozanek, our Regional Markets Sector Manager from Market and Infrastructure Policy. Milos?
Thank you, Isabella, and good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for joining us. I just wanted to go over and highlight some of the Edam milestones here before we get into the substantive discussion, and just acknowledge that we are in this phase of Edam technical workshops. We had our first workshop last Monday, or this past Monday, on transmission. Today we're focusing, both today and tomorrow, we're focusing on the resource sufficiency evaluation, and then we have a number of other workshops slated through the 27th, and we'll talk about those towards the close of the meeting, remind everybody of the schedule. But we're still on track for publication of a revised straw proposal, informed both by your comments as well as the discussions in these workshops, and publishing that on August 11th. So we really encourage robust discussion in these. We've framed the slides in such a way to encourage robust discussion on some very key and challenging topics. So by all means, please engage with us, share your perspectives, and both your comments and these workshop discussions are going to help really shape that next version of the revised straw proposal. So with that, let me turn it over to you, Danny, to walk us through the slides.
Sure. Thank you, Milos. So the first topic that we want to talk about today is actually something that we did not identify in the original scope for these two RSE workshops. However, the comments that were submitted on the straw proposal really indicate that the concept of running transmission constraints and having the Edam's RSC be transmission feasible is something that the stakeholder community wanted to explore, which is why we thought it was pertinent to try to add it to the topics we're going to be covering both today and tomorrow. Before we get into the potential benefits or drawbacks of that, I want to take a step back and get back to what is the Edam RSC's objective. And to us, at least, is to test if each BAA on a standalone basis prior to participating in the Edam has sufficient supply bids and schedules to meet its demand and uncertainty requirements. We talked about this quite a bit in the workshop process this last spring, and we kind of resolved, we thought, to go forward with an on-demand application that would optimally determine the feasibility of the bid set made available by each BAA by testing it against the demand forecast for each BAA, as well as the uncertainty requirement for each BAA that the CAISO would calculate. So while this is on demand, we were also planning for 2 advisory runs. We identified 6 a.m. and 9 a.m. as preset advisory runs before the final binding run at 10 a.m. This does serve a couple purposes. When we were planning to run this calculation, the application that generates the uncertainty requirement is not something that we would be able to support on demand. So we thought, okay, let's run it at 6 a.m. Let's run it at 9 a.m. That can generate an uncertainty requirement that could then be used for subsequent on-demand runs. We also would run it at 9 a.m. and then lock all inputs in the Edam RSC, giving a stable curing period between the final run at, or the final advisory run at 9 a.m. and the eventual binding run at 10 a.m. I do want to note that as conceived, this application would test for feasibility across the upcoming 24-hour period. This implicitly tests for both capacity and flexibility. If you're testing to ensure that you can meet the hourly demand and uncertainty requirements in each hour throughout the day, you are by definition testing if you can ramp between those requirements as well. We explicitly did not consider transmission or transmission constraints in the application that we were thinking of. Effectively, we were looking to model basically every generator in a BAA as well as all the load on a single bus. This application would be a fairly complicated unit commitment optimization, basically using all of the resource models, resource models offered by the Cal ISO. The reason we went in this direction was in response to stakeholder, we thought consensus on trying to facilitate an on-demand test that could be run whenever in the upcoming day, or whenever prior to actually running the Edam. What we saw in the comments was that there is a desire to potentially validate the deliverability of the capacity that is shown by each BAA. The sentiment was that if we aren't validating this through the transmission network, then you could allow an Edam BAA to pass the Edam RSE with a bid set that actually wouldn't be deliverable when we go to run the market itself. This could become problematic in tight supply conditions because the footprint as a whole could not have sufficient supply to clear the market. We also saw comments noting that there was a feasibility test that is a component of the WEIM RSC. That is correct. There's currently an advisory test that is run as one of the 4 components of the WEIM RSC, and its goal is to just highlight potential congestion given the base schedules that are submitted by every WEIM BAA, and then provide an opportunity for that WEIM BAA to modify their schedules to try to resolve that congestion. It's actually more or less part of the real-time market application. We're running the real-time market already. We have the base schedules. We're just running with those base schedules in the market. This is significantly different than how we've conceived of the Edam RSC, which again was more of a standalone application that wasn't having to run through our full market systems, which is likely what we would need to do if we want to consider transmission constraints. So all that being said, I think the CAISO is open to considering transmission constraints and transmission or network transmission in the Edam RSC if that's the consensus going forward. However, we do question if this strikes the right balance between accuracy of the test itself, and we'll talk about how using transmission constraints may not be as accurate as it may seem off the cuff, as well as the desire for on-demand results. So given that's kind of the backstory of why we are where we are right now, are there any questions? Okay. I think Isabella noted earlier, we do intend this to be kind of an interactive workshop. So to the extent anybody has questions and they get tired or want to hear somebody else's voice, please feel free to speak up.
It looks like we do have a question in the chat.
Actually, I see a caller in the queue.
Okay, go ahead.
Please go ahead. Your line is unmuted.
Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Yes.
This is Stuart Kelly from LADWP. I'm not quite sure what value running the tests before the actual run at 6 a.m. and 9 a.m. with the transmission constraint adds. Because at the end of the day, if an entity were to put in supply bids for those pre-runs and they didn't have the deliverability, then they're going to fail during the market run. So what value, and we lose the on-demand component, what value does that add? It's not in the entity's interest to do that. Am I missing something?
I don't think you're missing something, Stuart. I don't think any entity would knowingly put bid in supply that they know is undeliverable. I think the questions, as we'll see in the next couple slides, are really what are the impacts of flow and the network transmission in your neighbors that could affect a deliverability of supply in any particular BAA.
But we wouldn't see that, right? Because you're testing that BAA footprint only. Maybe the market operator would see it, but I'm sure how would we get the feedback on flow or whatever? It's only the market operator would see that, right? And they're only going to be interested in the run from 10 till 10 a.m.
Yeah, Stuart, I think 2 slides from now, we really kind of explore the exact issue you're talking about. So
right. Oh, perfect.
I think we should table it and then
we
can have we can have slides to reference off of, but thank you.
Perfect. Thank you.
I do see one more caller in the queue. Please go ahead. Your line is unmuted.
Hi, this
Hello?
is Todd Ryan with Pacific Gas and Electric.
Oh. Hi, Todd.
Can you hear me? Hey.
Yes.
Thank you. As one of the commenters that asked for a further discussion on this topic, I thought I would also highlight another reason why it's important to just have a discussion on this topic. I think that when we first envisioned the RSE, we didn't quite have an understanding of where the consequences of failure were headed, and so given that the direction of consequences has moved away from physical limits and towards a more market-driven prospect, there may be less need or less concern about having a perfect set of resources in the test and being able to run it many times. So it's just another reason why we should have this discussion about whether this functionality is still needed, given that there are changes in the consequences, as well as the changes of now the plan is to use the solution as part of the GHG accounting. So, things have just shifted since the original test. And so I thank you for setting this up.
Okay. Thanks, Todd. Yeah, and I think you are highlighting that all this stuff is pretty interwound, where the failure consequences end up inform how stringent the test might look. So that does make sense. Are there any more questions?
I do not see any callers in the queue as of now.
Okay. So if we wanted to do this, what would it actually look like? Well, I think the first thing to make clear is the KISO likely would no longer be able to support an on-demand application to execute the RSE. This would look more like the WEIM RSE, which is run at a few preset times prior to the binding interval. And the driver of this is it would require us to utilize the full network model and integrate all of our systems basically into running the RSE. We would essentially be running a simplified proxy version of the market before we're actually running the market. Even if you assume that we can do all this integration, which I'm pretty confident we can, there are a number of additional variables that get introduced that each BAA would then have to wrestle with. And these would be changing inputs such as transmission outages, which are going to change the network impedance, which are going to affect the power flow, path limit changes, constraint adjustments. The more moving pieces you have, the validity of the advisory runs, or the less useful those advisory runs could be, because transmission outages could completely unravel what you would expect your deliverability to be. So that's just extra food for thought. If we do go this direction, I think we'd still look to freeze the test at 9 a.m., but there could be a little bit of a trade-off of having changing system conditions that are changing throughout the preset advisory runs. Next, feasibility is not isolated. If we're really looking for feasibility of the supply that's available in each BAA, that feasibility is not isolated to that BAA. Rather, it's going to be based on the simultaneous resource bids and demand across the entire footprint when we run the market. This is really the subject of, I think, 2 slides from now, so I'm going to put a pin on this and we'll come back to it later. If we wanted to do this, we would likely be running everything using DC power flow solutions. This is a trade-off to get performance and be able to run this thing during a few advisory intervals. If you use DC, you would obviously not have as accurate of losses. You'd have to assume some standard loss factors, which we'd need to probably work with each BAA to identify. I think it's in a lot of BAAs. So this may not be insurmountable, but it's something that we would have to consider putting in the RSE. We would also have a little bit of a trade-off on how often we would be calculating the shift factor matrices for this proxy market run. This is another very computationally intensive process. The more often advisory runs would be desired, there may be a trade-off where we would be using older shift factor matrix calculations in those advisory runs, simply because we are not going to be able to support consistently rerunning that app or rerunning the code that generates those matrices. The final thing I want to point out is we may have a limited ability to model RASs and nomograms in this proxy market run. In our full market run, we are able to model these. If you don't, it could raise the possibility for false positives. And I think a simple example could help with this. Imagine you have a few generators connected through 2 radial lines to the network system. This is not an uncommon setup. You lose one line, you could have an overload of the remaining line. One of the common techniques that we've seen to prevent this from happening is you use a remedial action scheme such that when you lose one line, some subset of the generation that's radially connected also trips offline, preserving the security of the remaining line. This is something that we are good at and we are able to model when we actually run the market. Our ability to do this level of detailed modeling in kind of this proxy pre-market run is an open question. I think if you wanted to try to do this again, then there will be even less advisory runs going forward. Just additional it's something that I think that everybody should give thought to, because all of these things come with trade-offs, accuracy versus how often we'd even be able to manually run the EDMR, or in advisory form, run the EDM RSE. Oh, sure. I see a question.
Caller, please go ahead. Line is unmuted.
Did someone choose to say?
I'm sorry about that.
All right. I'm in the room. Carrie Bentley with the Western Power Trading Forum. Thank you, Danny. I really appreciate the way the KISO and you have laid this out. We are one of the stakeholders who asked for this consideration, so we appreciate that. And in my mind, the on-demand run, I've said this before, but it serves two purposes, the RSE test and the GHG counterfactual. And I think the way you laid this out convinces me that it'd be very hard to argue for the benefits of this for the RSE test alone. And so I think that brings us to your next slides, which is, does this work within the GHG? But the one thing you could just kept emphasizing right now was that this would limit your ability to do multiple runs. Does it also limit your ability to do a single run? Can you model the RAS as if you just would do this one time for a counterfactual? It was really unclear where the complication was met. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks, Gary. I think the complication is going to come down to computationally how often we can do this. I think we can model all this stuff. It just takes time to run, which I think does transition nicely into the next slide. The other real driver of the consideration of transmission in the Edam RSE was to potentially use this as a more accurate counterfactual for the resource-specific GHG approach. Now, I just spent an entire slide kind of listing through all the accuracy trade-offs that we would have to consider and how often we would want to run this in advisory form prior to the market itself. I want to bifurcate that discussion a little bit from a GHG counterfactual. I think to the extent that there's a desire for a more accurate GHG counterfactual and it's not having to be iteratively run, I think some of those accuracy trade-offs might not be as necessary. Obviously, this is something that we'd probably need to run by our technology team and figure out exactly where those trade-offs are. But I do think there's the possibility for a more accurate non-RSE GHG resource-specific counterfactual run prior to running the Edam RSE. There are still some open policy questions about what this run would look like and how accurate that counterfactual would be, which we'll go through on the next slide. But I wanted to pause here and see if there's kind of any questions on this concept of separating the two.
Hey, this is Michelle Keto from CPUC. This is a little bit before this. But one question I have is, I understand based on the comments that CAISO is considering not allowing intertie bids to count for the CPUC's or the CAISO's RSC. So if you ran this, would you run this without those intertie bids? In which case, wouldn't the transmission not really be very useful because it's not what you'd actually run in the market?
Oh, I want to table the concept of discussing whether or not the CAISO intertie bid should be counted in the RSC, because I think we're talking about that tomorrow. If I understood you correctly, you're saying would the transmission or the power flows not be very realistic because it'd be a fairly different flow pattern than what we'd see running the market? And I do think that's a fair point. And really this gets to, I think, the questions 2 slides from now.
Okay, thanks.
We do have a question over the phone.
Yes. Caller, please go ahead. The line is unmuted.
Hey, Danny, this is Todd Ryan from PG&E. Can you go back 1 slide, please?
Yeah.
Yeah. Something just kind of wasn't clear to me. When you say that the DC runs would have less accurate losses, you're comparing that to an AC power flow, but it would still be more accurate than what you're proposing currently of just doing a single bus, correct?
Yeah, absolutely, Todd. Running power flow with transmission constraints is going to be much more accurate than kind of our conception of a single bus model. I'm just trying to point out that if the real driver was try to make sure the capacity is deliverable when we actually run the market and are running AC power flow, it's not an apples to apples comparison on losses.
Understood. But just to be clear, we're talking about a step forward in accuracy. We're not getting all the way to full AC, but we're talking about transmission would be generally a step forward in accuracy.
Yeah. I think it definitely could be viewed as being a more accurate test.
Great. Thanks.
Oh, George?
think George Angelides is on the line with a question.
George, please go ahead. George, looks like you're muted. Can you please unmute and proceed? I cannot hear you, George. Okay, looks like he's having some audio issues.
Okay, well, maybe we'll come back to George.
Maybe this is Mark Rothader. One other idea that we internally discussed and explored, and maybe it's a simplification of the DC further, and that is, can you find areas where you create these cut planes that are relevant cut planes, because you know that those are areas are potentially could get supply bottled up and there's not enough transmission to get out. It's not a simultaneous solution. It doesn't get all the transmission, but if the concern was key areas, it may help at least in that scenario. So that's another way of potentially doing it, but we'd have to define those areas up front and have them manageable. I was just trying to buy time for George.
Well, Carrie's going to help.
Carrie Bentley with the Western Power Trading Forum. Mark, we had that same idea too, actually, and we thought about putting that in and being like, we called it zonal, instead of cut planes, maybe a little more vague in our speak. But I think where I landed on that was it probably isn't worth it. Like the congestion patterns between day ahead and real time will probably change. It's really, you're not perfectly modeling the resources anyway. You're not going to have the imports in, most likely. I know we're not talking about that now, but we're not going to have all the bids in. So I really think for the RSE test, you don't need to model transmission, not even, in a zonal area. And that would be like a great thing to monitor going forward and seeing if you have a lot of deliverability issues. But really it isn't necessary for the RSE purposes. I have a completely different opinion when we get to GHG. But yeah, I think maybe I would caution the CAISO against going through a halfway approach. I actually think you put up a really good argument to say you don't need transmission for the RSE test. George, are you there? Is he in Greece? Yeah.
So I just want to make sure I'm tracking with what you're saying. So you would be in favor of a no transmission solution for the RSE itself, but then a separate run for purposes of just GHG baselining.
For counterfactual, yeah, I think that solves the issue Michelle brought up too with the imports, because you can include the import bids then in the counterfactual. So I think you actually end up with a really clean result.
Mm-hmm. Do others have different views who stated transmission was necessary in the RSE? Because I think there were other commenters who had different motivations about the concern about the I guess the integrity of the solution, whether it's builds enough confidence if something gets bottled up behind a transmission constraint for an RSE test itself. So.
Yeah, Mark, this is Mike Wilding from Pacificorp. I mean, that's my question, and that was Pacificorp's question, is does the RSE without the transmission constraints result in that confidence? And so I think you have laid out a good argument as to maybe why the transmission constraints may not be provide the value that we think they might in the RSE. But I would maybe like to hear a little bit more on CAISO's position on how you would still provide that confidence in the RSE without transmission constraints, that, there is not capacity stuck behind a constraint that's being relied on to pass the RSE.
Well, I think then I'll kind of at least walk through the rest of our logic, and then I think we can have more of a debate about how the CAISO might be able to instill that confidence. This slide lists some of the open policy questions that if we do want to do this, we're going to have to work through. Again, if you look at the Edam RSE, it's a standalone, it's a really, really fancy counting test that does each BA have sufficient supply to meet their obligations in the next day? Can it have a feasible operating plan on its own? It doesn't ensure simultaneous deliverability. The only thing that is going to do that is running the full market or some proxied version of it before we run the market. There are alternatives if we want to kind of go somewhere in between and run it on a BAA standalone basis. We could derate the internal transmission lines somewhat in the RSC through like a holdback mechanism. Maybe only 90% of each line's rating is available for use in the RSC to try to proxy some of the impacts that the rest of the network model will have on that individual BAA. Or we could go all the way to the other side and we could run the full optimization for all BAAs. This is how you do account for network transmission and the impacts of your neighbors. This then brings up kind of a sticky policy situation where one BAA could fail due to either loop flow or wheel through flow or transmission constraints that are active in their neighboring BAA. I think a simple example helps with this too. Imagine PNM, APS, and the California ISO BAA are all in Edam, and PNM and CAISO have exchanged a number of forward contracts, and CAISO is planning on utilizing some of its supply coming from PNM to clear the market. If we are actually running the market, this transfer is going to show up in the power flow, and it's going to show up coming across APS's internal system. This is going to change the congestion patterns in APS. If it deems some of the generation in APS undeliverable, does that mean APS fails the Edam RSE? Does it mean CAISO BAA fails the Edam RSE? How do you even unwind if it's due to the loop flow that is optimally calculated across the footprint? These are really complicated items, which I think we can work through if we really want to, pending what George says when he calls back in. But I do question, I think if it adds sufficient accuracy to spend the time and all the complication and implementation burden trying to figure this stuff out. The third bullet, yes.
So I want to ask you a question on that. I think that's a good example. I hear you. Is that if you do nothing and you allow all three of those entities to pass the resource sufficiency evaluation, you still have that same problem when you run the full market optimization. Do you have three entities that are resource sufficient, or do you have an insufficiency that you've now taken into the market?
Yeah, I think you have three BAAs who are resource sufficient. You may have a market footprint that may be resource insufficient. And this is a valid concern, which is, I think, why we're talking about it. My personal opinion is this feels like we should implement the most straightforward thing and then monitor and see if there's a problem before we have to explore and try to start testing for this and figure out how to do it. That's just me, but I'd like to hear from others kind of what your opinions on, or is this type of complication in spending the policy and implementation bandwidth trying to figure this stuff out necessary for day one go live of the Edam, or can we put a pin in it, monitor, and see if we need to allocate resources there later?
I think we do have George back on the line. So George?
George, we
can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yes.
How about now?
Now I can hear you.
Thank you. This is George Angelinski with BSO. Apologies, had some issues here with the microphones. Can you hear me well? Okay, thank you.
Yes.
Thank you. So
what I wanted to say is that if we perform the RSC with transmission constraints, it's still performed on a BAA by BAA basis. So we're not going to be obviously co-optimizing across BAAs. That will defeat the purpose of the RSC since we're testing a BAA at the time. So even if we add a network model for the BAA so that we can enforce transmission constraints for that BAA, the power flow pattern and the transmission congestion pattern that we will be solving is not going to be realistic. It's probably going to be completely different with the pattern of power flows and transmission congestion that you will see in the market when you optimize across all BAAs using transfers. As you know, the RSC, we're not using any transfers. We're solving for each BAA. The bucket one transfer, we simply use it to transfer requirements. So I think it is a mistake to include transmission constraints in the RSC. We will basically have potentially many false negatives. We will putting a lot of burden to Edam BAAs to pass a resource sufficiency evaluation subject to some constraint pattern that may be completely unrealistic. There was a good question about the use of the solution for the greenhouse gas reference. This is in relation to the methodology that we have for currently in the Western EAM, where we use a solution as a reference for calculating the limit of how much greenhouse gas attribution we will give to external resources from a greenhouse gas regulation area. But even there, that methodology of greenhouse gas attribution ignores constraints completely. Transmission constraints are not a factor in the allocation of greenhouse gas attributions. So again, even there, I don't see the value. I only see negative value for having burdening the RSC with transmission constraint and model for that purpose. Thank you.
Can I ask a question of George, if you can hear me? George, you say you if we were to incorporate transmission constraints, it would be on a balancing area basis at a time. What would you do for the balancing area that has resources in another area? Would you consider those non-simultaneously, or how would you do that?
Yes, thank you, Mark. This is the case of having resources that are pseudo-tied to a BAA, but they're physically located in a different BAA. We haven't covered that in the discussion so far, but obviously these resources should be considered in the resource sufficiency evaluation of a BAA, and even strengthens the argument that we should not have a network model, because that would be very complicated. How are you going to consider external resources from a BAA and perform the test only for that BAA? Whereas if you don't have a network model, obviously all resources, as Danny said at the beginning of this discussion, it's like they're all located in the same bus, right? You don't have a network model, so you can have in the same bus essentially as a figure of speech. In the same bus also the resources that are pseudo-tied to BAA, so there's no problem. It's very easy to solve that. But if you have to include a network model, now it's really a good question. How are you going to model pseudo-tied resources from another BAA? I don't have the solution.
So again, you're convincing me that the RSC does not need there's negative value for including the transmission constraints in the RSC. But still, what I am not hearing is some of us that propose this solution for, having inaccurate RSCs, what I'm not hearing is a solution to the problem. I'm hearing this is not the solution, but I'm not hearing a discussion on what the solution is. And I can wait for like 3 or 4 slides, but that's where I would like this discussion to go.
I offered a partial solution, and that was you create these known areas or zones, if you want, that are known to be constrained, and at least that mitigates the concern. It doesn't eliminate it, but it mitigates the large ones. Absent that, it will be the responsibility of the balancing area. And frankly, we could take the position that it's the balancing area's responsibility to resolve those known constraints in their area and not give us a set of offers that are going to conflict with those. That's probably difficult, but that is balancing area responsibility in a way.
In the room, so we'll take that, and then I think we have one over the phone.
Carrie Bentley with the Western Power Trading Forum. I completely hear what you're saying. I agree it's a great question. And I'm wondering whether we're jumping straight to a solution rather than, I hear you, is it a concern? We don't even know, we don't have the transparency to know whether it's an issue or not. So I think some transparency around, do we have dispatchability issues? Are there transmission localized constraints? I mean, everyone has to operate to the same NERC standards around transmission outages, right? So we should have some comfort there. So, I mean, I think really honing in on transparency and do we even need a solution would be the first step before just jumping to a, zonal approach.
Fair enough. And I mean, I can't deny that there are those types of constraints. And if we look at WEAM, we do provide a feasibility flow information to help the balancing area resolve this ahead in real time. So there are those areas. They're not all over the place. It's not like it's a super constrained situation, but there are those situations that do exist. Now, how bad will it be or how good will it be in Edam? I don't know. And this is where I think a rational approach is, let's see how it goes. Let's see how different it is. Provide some transparency. Visit it after a period of time and see how different constrained it is from the actual market result and use that information. That is one possibility.
I think that's a good one. I did note that on slide 9, you mentioned that there is a WEAM RSC and you haven't seen significant issues. So maybe that will give you some comfort. And then continuing to publish those metrics. At least if I were you, I'd feel more comfortable knowing that. Yeah. And then I had 2 things in response to George. First, George, I know you're in Greece. You are talking so fast. When you talk again, and I'm sure you were, and I will love to hear you speak, can you just talk a little bit slower so we could follow you? And I think you're going to talk because I'm going to disagree with you about something you just said. And that's that in EIM, transmission doesn't matter for the GHG test, but I think it will in EDAM because you're going to deem and attribute dispatch resources relative to the counterfactual, and the counterfactual will be different whether you do include or don't include transmission. So I agree with you that in EIM, transmission doesn't matter, but I think it does matter in EDAM. And so that's why I wanted to have the conversation about whether it's needed in the GHG counterfactual. Thanks.
Do we have George?
Yeah, George, do you agree with me?
Talk slower.
George, please unmute your line.
Yes, Carrie's right. The impact of the transmission congestion will have a different solution, a different outcome, which will be used according to our proposal for calculating the greenhouse gas reference for attributions. The question is, if we include the transmission constraints for a given BAA and ignore every other BAA when we perform the test, will that pattern of transmission congestion be representative of what you're going to have in the market for calculating a reference for the greenhouse gas attribution? And obviously it's not, because you're solving a completely different problem. Now, one could imagine that perhaps a better solution for a reference for the greenhouse gas would be if we solve all BAAs without transfers into the greenhouse gas regulation areas, and you could potentially enforce transmission constraints there, you don't have the full optimal solution. You're still going to have a different solution from the market solution, but maybe that's the objective of finding a reference that says how resources are going to be dispatched optimally outside of greenhouse gas regulation areas for solving load only outside of greenhouse gas regulation areas. But that will be a different problem. And if that is the point of including transmission constraints, then it's something that we can consider as different from the RSC at this point. So for the purpose of the RSC, I think I am convinced personally that we should not include transmission constraints. For the greenhouse gas attribution, I guess we can have some more discussion on that.
Thanks, George. Yeah, in my mind, it gets a lot simpler when we're just on the GHG because the counterfactual should not have transfers because it's a counterfactual. It's the whole point of doing it. So we don't even have to have that whole debate around how the transfers would occur. But I am curious, I assumed that if we did it just for the counterfactual, we would do it by GHG area and not by BAA. And can you talk more about how feasible that is? And do you have the ability to even do that in your market and model transmission constraints?
It's something that we have toyed a little bit in our earlier discussions on having a preliminary market run, essentially, where you don't have transfers between the no greenhouse gas zone and the greenhouse gas regulation areas, so that this optimal solution will give you, as I said earlier, how resources external to greenhouse gas regulation areas are optimally scheduled to meet external load. That would be a good reference for calculating greenhouse gas attributions in the full market solution. But that will require a full market run, which we have not considered so far in our discussions, and obviously it has a large impact on performance. So at this point, it's something new. We haven't really looked for the feasibility of this. So that's why I said we should probably have some more discussion on it.
Thanks, George.
We do have a question over the phone, so let's go ahead and take that one.
Yes, I do see a couple of callers. Going on to the first caller, please go ahead. Your line is unmuted. Caller, please accept the message to become unmuted and proceed with your question. Please unmute your line, accept the message to become unmuted and proceed with your question.
Maybe we can go to the next caller and come back.
Okay, sure. Please go ahead. Your line is unmuted.
Hi, good afternoon. This is Jeff Spires with PowerX. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Yes, we can.
Okay, great. Thank you. I think that the question that Mike was raising earlier is really the right question around the RSC, which is, what transmission considerations are potentially needed to be confident that the test is sufficiently accurate. And it does seem like that's a difficult question. In my mind, just listening to the dialogue so far, I'm thinking of that in two categories as far as the supply that's going into the test. The first category being imports. I think for imports, transmission is something that should be considered. And in particular, that revolves around validating that transmission has been arranged to deliver external supply to the BA that's counting it for purposes of resource sufficiency. So, in the example that Danny, you gave earlier about a resource delivering from P&M across Arizona into the CAISO, I think that should then require that they've demonstrated they've arranged the transmission on the P&M system for the export and across the Arizona system, and that transmission is of a sufficiently high priority that there's comfort that that it will be delivered. But at a minimum, ensuring that transmission has been arranged associated with the imports. I think that's probably something that will come up later today in the context of the Wspp discussion, but that's at least one area or one element of validating imports that ensures that those external resources have transmission associated with them and that they've been scheduled and there's confidence that they can be delivered to the BA that's receiving them. I think the second category beyond imports then is the internal generation to load, and I thought that what Mark Rothleader was suggesting seemed pretty logical. And the one that sort of comes to mind to me as a good example is the CAISO BA, something like Path 26 or a constraint along those lines. You might have other BAs that have similar major transmission lines where it could be logical to say that some incorporation of those types of significant constraints within a BA should be considered to make sure that the comparison between internal generation and the load is realistic. So in my mind, those are a couple of ways to ensure that to some degree transmission is considered without having to go the full-blown power flow analysis and worry about the complications that brings forward. I do think that some middle ground is probably the right approach.
Thanks, Jeff. So I think if I heard you right, then you're kind of thinking Mark's idea of having almost zonal RSEs within a BAA with pre-identified import constrained or export constrained zones would be a potential solution if this is a concern, which I think that probably, if we do want to go forward with this, would be a lot cleaner and easier to implement than trying to run the market before the market.
Thanks, Danny. Yeah, that's consistent with what I was saying as well. Yes.
Yep.
Do we have any other questions over the phone?
Yes, I do see the caller who had raised their hand previously. Can you please go ahead? Your line is unmuted. Okay, looks like they have some issues, some audio issues.
Do we have any other questions in the room?
This is Mark. I'm hearing 2, possibly 3 pathways forward. Pathway 1 is do what's originally proposed, monitor and prepare to respond or come up with a solution, implement a solution if we actually experience undeliverable resources that are actually impeding the integrity of the RSE. We would commit under that to monitor, provide transparency, how frequently it's occurring, how much it's occurring, and we work together to assess it and act on that. I think path 2 is sort of what Jeff just described. I'll leave the Wspp Schedule C discussion till later because we're going to get into that, but kind of a middle road approach where you do rational zones just to make sure you don't have any major constraints bottled up. That seems like it's potentially implementable. I don't know if it jeopardizes the on-demand. We'd have to make that assessment. But I think that one is at least doable. And then the path 3 is the more elaborate, which we've discussed here, that would do some kind of optimization, enforce the constraints within the area. We'd have to work out between George and whether it's single balancing area or some kind of simultaneous. We'd have to work that out. But there's a lot of questions that arise, and there we cannot support on demand. We may be able to support timed checks somewhere along the way. So I guess those 3 pathways are how I'm seeing it, and seeking some feedback if those are where people stand. And I'm talking about just for the RSE itself. I'm going to debate the appropriateness of the solution for GHG. Maybe we should do that and take that up in the GHG discussion itself.
We have a question here in the room.
Dave Rubin from NV Energy, or maybe a vote. I guess, Mark, I would vote for the option 1, the first one. And where I come from is, as the transmission provider here, we have to implement this. And we have to be able to sub-allocate these RS requirements to our own customers, which means they're going to have to know what they are in advance, and then they're going to have to be held to that, which also means that anything that qualifies as a designated network resource today is going to have to count for this test. And we can't have the RSE test in Edam be different than the process that the OAT transmission providers have used to grant DNR status to resources on our system. It's got to count. And to second guess that through this process is just going to create chaos and lead us into different procurement than we've been able to do with our long-term planning based on the DNR process.
Not to pitch you against someone behind you, but how do you address the concern? I hear your support the option 1, but how do you address the concern?
In other words, obviously the process we've relied on has been a physical rights model. So in theory, there shouldn't be a problem here because we have bought the transmission in order to bring it in. I mean, 25% of my load is primarily WSPP Schedule C contracts coming in. So that should be firm and it should be reliable, and it has historically. You know, otherwise we would have been screaming about this a long time ago. So if we're going to honor that past practice, we have to basically say that the test counts those resources. We can't be in a process where we're buying on top of what that plan has been. And historically, that has been reliable. And so if there's something wrong here, it's a way that the dispatch for the market is overlying what has historically been used to schedule resources into our system and within our system. And so
I may say it a different way, but, yeah. But I mean, okay, I'm not being cute here, but the market does find things that the traditional path, contract path does not see, and it exposes it. So,
but is that an RS, resource efficiency test failure or something else that has to be addressed?
Okay, I'm tracking with you.
Do we have any questions over the phone?
I do not see any callers in the queue as of now.
Okay, well, that's all we had for this topic. I think Mark identified a couple different paths. We're not taking comment on these workshops, but I think we'll probably indicate that CAISO's leaning in the next iteration of the proposal, but also potentially spill some ink on detailing how the kind of the compromise in between solution with a zonal RSE would work, or the full-blown proxy of the market run before the market could work. And I guess we will take more formal comments in that venue. Okay, well, I think that we can then move on to the next subject item or the next topic. We are calling for a 15-minute break. I think we're about 15 minutes ahead of schedule, so I'll go ahead and run through the background slides that will set up the WSPP Schedule C discussion. Then I think we can take the break and then come back and launch into that discussion. So in the straw proposal, the CAISO put forward a proposal to account for and utilize WSPP Schedule C supply in both the Edam RSC as well as in running the market itself. This was broadly supported by commenters. I think what Dave just said about these being used and reliably used for quite a while was really came through in the comments. However, a number of stakeholders did identify outstanding concerns relating to source specificity, or more clearly, the lack of source specificity of some of these contracts in both trying to run an equitable Edam RSC as well as trying to run the market itself. These come in the form of the potential to double count resources in the Edam RSC, double allocate transmission capacity when you're running the market. There was also concerns and comments on the different methods which these could be modeled with, which would potentially impact the pricing accuracy of the day-ahead market. Are there any additional outstanding concerns kind of other than what was listed here that stakeholders would want to raise for today's discussion as well?
Do we have any questions over the phone?
I do not see any callers on the phone line as of now.
I think we have one question in the room.
This is Michelle Keto from the CPUC. Are you only proposing to allow WSPP Schedule C or WSPP Schedule C like contracts? So we do have some that are not exactly WSPP.
I think that would come down to what the difference in attributes are. And if this is kind of getting back to the import bid counting discussion, I think that we should kind of table it again until that topic comes up.
Well, hopefully that's not. I mean, so we allow firm import contracts that they say that they aren't sourced from the CAISO, in addition that they must deliver. So I'm hoping that all the import contracts that the CPUC has approved for use of its LSEs, that you're including those in this. And if you're not, then I think we do have a problem.
I think that's reasonable to include those in the discussion we're going to have this afternoon. My understanding was a lot of those import contracts actually are WSPP Schedule Cs.
Yeah.
So to the extent they're not, what would be the primary differences?
Yep. I want to be clear. I don't think we're backing away from the position that the RA imports should be countable. We believe that those are WSPP Schedule C or WSPP Schedule like. And that's when we get to the intertie bid discussion, that's not about the RA bids. Okay.
So. Yeah, that was my understanding. I just wanted to clarify, since this in the context of this use, they're saying WSPP Schedule C. So as long as we're WSPP Schedule like, then that's fine. Thank you.
Yeah, Michelle. Our objective is to try to count anything that has been forward contracted and is reliable.
Okay, thank you.
Any other questions? Okay, so kind of a mandatory background slide, make sure everybody's on the same page with what these contracts typically entail. These are typically firm supply contracts that can be made with either the merchant arm of different BAAs or third-party marketers. The reliability is typically guaranteed by a mixture of liquidated damage clauses and business reputational risk. Nobody wants to have their contracts not show up during tight supply conditions. That makes you are less likely to get business going forward, is what the ISO has been told. Under the current structure, though, the source specificity and the transmission path may not be known at the time that we are planning to run the day-ahead market. Often what is known is just the delivery point where the title to the power is transferred. Typically, this ends up being the tie into the sync BAA. So in CAISO terms, this is like the scheduling point into the BAA. Also, these contracts have varying durations. They can go from yearly contracts to hourly arrangements. So there are a number of different flavors of WSPP Schedule C contracts. So as we have this discussion, if that ends up informing how these are used or how they might be considered in the RSC or the market, that would be good to know. So the CAISO's current proposal, going into a little more depth of what we had in the straw proposal, was to credit these as supply in the Edam RSC. We would then look to use these in the market. We would require the supply to be self-scheduled into the sync BAA at a pre-identified scheduling point. We would then look to model that injection within the security constrained dispatch of the market itself. To be able to do that, we would have to source that injection from somewhere. Our proposal was to source it from the distributed generation aggregation point on the source side of the scheduling points. So in layman's terms, this would be the adjacent BAA where you would think the power is flowing through based off where the tidal to power transitions. When I say distributed generation aggregation point, this is kind of a wonky CAISO term. Think 100 megawatt injection and 50 generators in the neighboring BAA. We would source 2 megawatts per generator to source the supply to model this injection. We did also show a willingness to consider any incentives that could create additional confidence in these types of arrangements. These could be day-ahead E-tags. These could be monitoring. These could be retroactive adjustments to the RSC counting paradigm. I think we're open to all these ideas. We just need to hear more from stakeholders about what the correct incentives look like. Yes, and I was going to stop here, or take a couple questions, and then once we get through questions, I think we can take a break and then go through kind of those outstanding concerns on these contracts.
Yeah, this is Michelle Keto from the CPUC again. So right here on bullet 2, it says requires supply to be self-scheduled into the sync BAA. So I would note that the CPUC import requirements are that they self-schedule or bid at 0 to negative 150. So are you saying that they have to be self-scheduled?
Nope. I'm not trying to rewrite RA rules here.
Okay, so then what does it mean requires supply to be self-scheduled?
If these are, so your point is, could there be exceptions for WSPPs if they potentially would bid in below 0 in the market construct?
Yeah, I mean, it says require, so that's what I'm
focused on. That's a fair point. And we don't want to discount forward contracted RA supply. So I think to the extent that these would be import bids that would be bid in below 0, if we can table this again to the import bid counting section, we specifically address that. And we would propose to count them.
Okay, and then I would also note that there are WSPP capacity contracts that do bid, so I guess you're proposing that those would not count? I mean, we don't use them, but other people do.
Other people use supply contracts that wouldn't be made available to the market?
Yeah, they're made available with a bid. Okay, so there's an energy contract and there's a capacity contract. So we're requiring that ours be energy and that they either self-schedule or bid 0 or negative 150 so that we're certain that they flow between the hours of 5 and 9 p.m. There are other kinds of contracts that are just a bid. So are you proposing that those would not count?
You're saying there's other contracts that are just bidding in economically?
Yeah, they're capacity contracts, right?
I think in the Edam RSC, we are trying to validate if the bids made available to the market are sufficient to clear the market. We have this carve out and we do say require, but the idea behind self-scheduling is we would know that they would be available to clear the market.
Okay, so self-schedule or bid into the market then.
I think if we want to explore WSPPs getting bid into the market by potential Edam BAAs, that's a very different question. A lot of the assumptions that we made is these are self-scheduled, and a lot of the reasons that entities say we can confidently count on them is they would plan on self-scheduling into their BAA in the market. It's part of their forward plan. They've contracted for it. It's going to show up regardless.
Okay, thank you.
I see another question in the room.
Thanks, Carrie Bentley with the Western Power Trading Forum. And don't get excited. This is a really dumb question, probably, and it's just due to my lack of familiarity. Why is a self-schedule? Why are you being able to count on that more than if they bid into the market? I don't quite understand. Both are, obligations to provide energy at either a price or at whatever price. I guess I don't understand the difference.
Yeah, I think that we've thought of this largely in terms of the WSPPs that the potential EDAM BAs will use. And so what we've heard is they have forward contracts for these, and they would plan for them to flow in real time. So the easiest way to make sure that you would see them flow in real time is they would get a day ahead award. The easiest way to do that is make sure they're self-scheduled and they're not economically bid in and potentially wouldn't get an award.
I guess I'm still missing it. Why do you care if they flow in real time? As contracts evolve and as we need more flexibility because of renewable integration, it just seems like if they could be flexible, maybe contracts would evolve that way. And so as long as they show up in real time, I just don't understand why self-scheduling makes them more likely to show up.
And that's a fair point. And I would almost turn back to the EDAM BAAs. If you're comfortable with these bidding in real time and have the ability to, I guess, defer or not take delivery of that energy if it's not awarded, is that feasible under your current contracts that you're using?
Well, and to add to that. Okay.
Actually, I cannot hear the audio well.
Thank you. And I wanted to add on to Danny's question, if the EIM entities wouldn't mind answering too, do you need the CAISO to say it has to be self-scheduled? Or if you want it to be self-scheduled, isn't that just part of your own contracting?
Just say yeah.
I don't work for PAC. I don't know what you're going to say.
We were actually just talking about this.
I'll take a shot and then I'll let the two of them correct me. I'd say, Carrie, I think the way we would look at it is the market has to accommodate self-schedule. It doesn't have to mandate it. And then over time, I think you would expect these products to evolve. But what we're trying to do is, look at our customers who may have made multi-year arrangements here, especially those, for example, retail choice who opted for separate supplier, and to be able to continue to do what they've been doing, but then begin to transition and maybe see different opportunities that exist. So I guess that's the way I would characterize it. Accommodate but not mandate.
I'll just say I think that's a really good way to put it. Kathy and I were just talking and saying, if it's moving from outside of the EDAM footprint, we think, you got to accommodate that self-schedule. But if we're transacting amongst ourselves, do we need a self-schedule, right? If we enter into that bilateral deal for, the quarter or the month or even the day ahead, could we let the market optimize that? And does it have to be self-scheduled? So.
I think that's where the products will get to.
Yeah, right.
Just a reminder, if you have source specificity, you don't need to self-schedule. You just bid it in and it works naturally. We're trying to find a reasonable accommodation for those schedules that can't define source specificity at the time of the market run. That was why we got to this point. Schedule C may not have that at 10 a.m. And the idea of the self-schedule was a proxy that says, okay, this is really coming. It's not just left to the market devices, and we have some certainty about it for the purposes of the RSC tests.
Well, I think that's fair. And look, sitting here today, I would say that the West is evolving on this issue. I think if you look at the wrap forward requirements, they're probably different than sort of the traditional contracting under WSPP Schedule C. And so I do think we're sort of moving to identifying a particular source, a particular path, making it available, not necessarily as a self-schedule. I just don't think we're ready to say all in on that as the rule today. I think it would make me a little bit challenged as the provider with existing customers with existing agreements. I think we'll get more towards that as we move forward, and I think that's eventually, hopefully, we get to just a full-blown RTO where you just bid, but we won't get there, so one step at a time.
Yeah, I think require may be the wrong word. We would definitely look to accommodate. The other question this does bring to mind is it strikes at the confidence of these if they're bid into the market. Does it give you heartburn if your neighbor is showing a bunch of non-resource specific supply that is bid in at or near the bid cap rather than self-scheduled and passing the Edam RSE? Just want to highlight a lot of what we're going to be talking about going forward is the confidence that you have supply backing these contracts. If you start allowing them to bid in if that supply is actually going to be needed and kind of put that into their bids, does that undermine the confidence, at least with go live, of these types of contracts?
The thought, it's almost like we're talking from two different perspectives, because the perspective that we have as LSEs and regulated LSEs is if we buy something, we're going to need to show to the PUCN that we used it or we got a better price and didn't have to use it. So it's not, we really shouldn't be out there looking to find somebody who's going to bid at 1,000. We're really only going to be buying in the market beyond our own generation if, our resource optimization group thinks they need it. So that's the first showing to our commission. And the second will be, did we use what we bought or did we get a better deal for what we bought? So it's a bit of a different perspective on that.
Thanks so much. That was so incredibly helpful. I will just add, it sounds like some of the CAISO proposal then isn't so much for you guys. You just need that word to say accommodate, not require. And it more is a potential fear of gaming. I would put the idea that someone is economically withholding or manipulating the market in an entirely different bucket than solid market design. So I would hope that we could change this to accommodate self-schedules and then talk about what are the consequences, if you are phantom supply, what is economic withholding within an EDAM context? And I think that would be a good solution to everyone. Thanks.
Yeah, I think that's a reasonable point, Carrie. See one more question.
We do have a question from Jeffrey Nelson from SCE. He said that I thought only the CAISO BA would allow bids at the boundaries ties. So doesn't the self-schedule rule only apply to the non-CAISO BAs? And George agrees with that statement.
So Jeff's point then is that if you start allowing bid-in WSPP contracts, that starts to look a lot like intertie bidding in each EDAM BAA, which is, again, I think a fair point. Michelle, did you still have a question? Okay. Well, then not hearing any more questions, I think we'll take a quick 15-minute break and then reconvene at 2:30.
Danny, we actually did have a question over the phone.
Okay.
Do we still have that caller in the queue?
Yes. Caller, please go ahead. Your line is unmuted.
Thank you, Danny. One of the things that I was kind of hoping to hear out this dialogue is how much of those Schedule C contracts can we actually identify the source, identify the path? Because I understand that, typically it may not be available, but in terms of price formation or whatever, I think, and trying to avoid this DGAP approach as much as possible, if we could at least make a step in the right direction, I think we're going to be in a far better place.
I completely agree, Stuart, and I think you may have read ahead a little bit, because I think ultimately
I haven't
best way would be to evolve these contracts and at least have some level of source specificity. But I think we can talk about why exactly that might be after the break. Did I understand you right, though? You're just kind of saying that more information is better regarding
I would imagine, absolutely, it has to be. And I would imagine that some of it can be identified. I don't know what the overall percent is, but I would imagine it could be with some effort. And I think we'd be in a better place if we at least head down that path. But if we're going to wait till contracts actually involve themselves, we might be waiting a long time. So I don't know if you have information or others have information about what percentage they think they could actually identify in terms of source and path without too much effort.
I wholeheartedly agree. I can't identify that because I'm not working for any of the potential Edam BAAs, but we do have a lot of their representatives in the room. So I think after the break, that would be a good question to explore, because we do have some ideas around potentially setting volume limits on these type of supply contracts. And that may inform where those volume limits are and then could potentially evolve to.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, do we have any other questions over the phone?
I do not see any other callers in the queue as of now.
Okay, then we'll take our 15-minute break and we'll see everyone back here at about 2:35. Well, it's been a great discussion so far today, and let's keep it moving forward. So I'm going to hand it back to Danny, and we will continue with our workshop. So Danny, I will pass it over to you.
Okay. So we left off talking about kind of the background on the WSPP Schedule C supply contracts. We left off that the CAISO obviously wants to consider these. Now we're going to try to walk through what are some of the outstanding concerns that were raised in the comments and that the ISO has identified that we likely need to work through to be able to accommodate these types of supply contracts. So this first example is what happened, or what are the impacts of the lack of source specificity on how a WSPP Schedule C contract would be counted in the Edam example, or in the Edam RFC. This example is pretty simple, but I think there's a powerful takeaway that we're going to have to solve. And in this example, you have BAA1, it signs a supply contract for 100 megawatts with marketer A. Marketer A typically sources 100 megawatts from a pool of resources in BAA2. BAA2 is an Edam member. Under the current construct that we're considering in the Edam, all of the supply within BAA2 would be showing toward passing BAA2's Edam RSC. Now in surplus conditions, effectively BAA1 has used BAA2 supply to pass the Edam RSC, and marketer A is receiving a premium for facilitating the transaction between a willing buyer and a willing seller. That's kind of what happens if everything goes well. This starts to break down in tight conditions. If BAA2 is showing all of its supply with physically located within that BAA that hasn't otherwise been forward contracted to pass the Edam RSC, but BAA1 is also representing the potential to source the supply from that power pool as a WSPP Schedule C injection into its BAA. Effectively, both BAAs would have passed the Edam RSC, but the Edam itself may have insufficient supply or the Edam would have sufficient supply because that WSPP is just going to be sourced from somewhere. But when you actually get to the real-time market, you may not have sufficient supply to support both the supply shown in BAA2 as well as the injection into BAA1. Essentially, the lack of source specificity could lead to the potential for double counting of supply resources in the Edam RSC. I'd like to pause and see if there's any questions on this example and then try to take a minute to work through how this could be avoided. I do see one question.
Hi, Ian White with Shell Energy. Just a clarifying question. When you say, does the marketer have a sort of a long-term contract for supply in BAA2, or is it sort of just an economy energy daily transaction?
I think
that may make a difference.
Yeah. I think the concerning version is if they're trying to scrounge up capacity through economy energy to satisfy the WSPP Schedule C contract. And that's one of the places that they may usually go to find residual energy to fulfill the contract.
Gotcha. Thank you.
Do we have any questions over the phone? Or sorry, another one in the room. Let's take this one in the room first.
So I'm just looking at this example and thinking, isn't the solution here, and what I always envisioned would be part of the RSC, is that if you have an off-system cell, so if BAA2 is selling to marketer A 100 megawatts, shouldn't their RSC have to show that they have enough to serve their load plus fulfill their obligation to marketer A? And that solves the issue of double counting.
I think that would definitely solve the issue. I think we've kind of proposed a similar concept with the bid range capacity trades, and really that's just adjustments for forward off-system sales. The problem comes in is there's maybe a third party involved who is facilitating that WSPP Schedule C, and they may not know where the power is coming from in the time frame that we're running the Edam RSC.
I'm not following that. So maybe you could explain that a little bit.
I think it's a little bit confusing, Danny, because you say that the marketer A sources 100 megawatt supply from pool resources in BAA2. That implies that marketer A knows that at the time of the market and the RSC test. If that's known, then it's a straightforward
yes
trade. Is that what you're trying to imply with this example?
No. What I'm trying to imply is they don't necessarily know where it's sourced from, but that may be a place that they do source it from. The problem is you don't know where it's sourced from. And absent knowing where it's sourced from, your solution of just kind of representing that as offsetting requirements is more challenging to implement. I mean, is this an unfounded concern? Do you as a BAA know always where the source that is fulfilling the WSPP Schedule C contract is at 10 a.m. the day prior?
No, but you typically have it tagged by 3 p.m.
And I think that kind of gets back to highlighting this is just a timing issue. We're running all of this before that 3 p.m. deadline. I mean, this is 5 hours before that. What do we know and when do we know it is kind of the question.
So, okay. So maybe if I could restate this example. Well, I don't want to try to restate the example on the fly, but the problem is, yeah. Sorry, I just got to think about this. The problem is not, no, I got to think about this for a minute, how I would restate this. But I guess what you're saying here is that someone is using the same resources to pass the RSC and make an off-system sell. So BA2 in this example is using the same resources to pass the Edam RSC and sell to marketer A. And
yes.
I think that just got to be not allowed. I mean, that hard stop, if you use your resources to pass the RSC, they have to be available to the market and they cannot be sold in the bilateral market. Like if you have, if you need all of your supply, just kind of extreme example, if you need all of your supply to pass the RSC plus, have your uncertainty requirement, any contingency reserves, or you cannot then sell 100 megawatts in the bilateral market to marketer A and at the expense of your RSC uncertainty requirement, for example.
Fair. I think that's reasonable. Before we go to another question, let me add a wrinkle. What if there's a third-party merchant generator in your BAA? Like right now under the proposed Edam formulation, all resources that have valid bids within that BAA would be shown to count towards the sufficiency of that BAA. So I think in your example, if it's a vertically integrated utility and you do control all the resources, yeah, that's a reasonable expectation. I think we could monitor for that. But if there are or generators that aren't part of your portfolio that operate in your balancing authority area, we'd have to figure out how those would be accounted for. And I think I did see another question.
Before we go to the other in-room questions, we do have 2 callers queued up. So let's go to the phone lines really quick and take one of those.
Sure. Caller, please go ahead. Your line is unmuted.
Thank you. Hi, it's Wsp with PowerX. I just wanted to chime in on this example. I think the far more realistic concern here is that what ultimately happens is marketer A sells to BA1 either on a forward or day-ahead basis, and they don't have any resources behind that. They are short and hoping to buy it potentially from BA2 or someone else in real time. And so, of course, there becomes a double counting concern because BA2 has no idea about this transaction. All that's gone on is the marketer has made a forward or day ahead short committing to BA1, and absent any validation of whether or not that transaction is supported by supply or transmission, you have a problem because BA1 is including supply that may have nothing behind it. And I think that's the crux of what this issue is. And, before the break, David Rubin mentioned that entities are recognizing the need to ensure that the contracts that they have are properly supported and that there's an evolution in the markets. And, he mentioned RAP, where those requirements include identifying the source and the transmission in a forward showing that's months ahead of time. We're not talking about that here, but we are talking about what do you do in the short term on a day ahead basis. And I recognize that based on today's world and the timing of scheduling, not all bilateral transactions may be identifiable at that 10 a.m. resource sufficiency evaluation timeline. I do think there will be some evolution, and ideally we'll get to a point where the majority of those transactions are identified by that time. But at a minimum, these transactions have to be e-tagged by 3 p.m. on a day-ahead basis. That is the absolute minimum to ensure that there actually is supply and transmission supporting an import before getting into real time. And there's just no reason not to require that. If an entity can't produce an e-tag and can't identify the supply or the transmission that it's using to support an import by 3 p.m. the day before, what other reason is there other than because it doesn't exist? So I think that that's really the crux of this issue. The double counting and the concern that comes from that is because there's no validation to ensure that this marketer that's committing to BA1 has actually secured supply or transmission to support that. And that's why, even if, and I recognize there's some complexities of the timing between 10 a.m. and 3 p.m., those sort of details aside, at a minimum, just from the credibility of the resource efficiency test and ensuring that that supply is actually supported by real transmission and real resources, having a requirement to say, look, by the end of the day at time frame, you should be able to produce something that shows that. That just seems like a common sense measure to me to make sure that we have more confidence in the accuracy of the test.
Yeah, thanks, Jeff. I think in the first part of your comment, you really did highlight kind of the crux of the issue that we're trying to address here. The second part relating to day-ahead e-tags, I think that's something that the ISO has expressed openness to. We plan to talk about that a little later this afternoon about how that would work, particularly given the timelines that we're planning to run the day-ahead market on. But again, you did highlight the concern that BAA1 may not know where marketer A is planning to source that power from, absent knowing that a double counting issue is possible.
I would just add to that one clarification to that is, even just more broadly beyond double counting, they don't have anything at that point. So what are you including as an import? It's not supported by actual supply.
And
you're just hoping
that we might hear, Jeff, is that these contracts that don't always require day-ahead e-tags, because I don't think that's an absolute standard on these types of contracts, have been utilized for years, if not decades, and a lot of other entities in this room have told me at least that they're highly reliable and that they do show up in real time. So I think it's trying to balance that these are used and for the most part have been represented as reliable with your concern.
Yeah, I think it would be good to hear feedback from others. And, in our experience, the vast majority of WSPP schedule transactions are tagged on a day-ahead basis. I don't know. I mean, I think it would be great to hear from others whether or not they would be comfortable buying energy that they're relying on and then being told that the seller will attempt to buy that from someone else in real time and show up if they're successful. I don't think that that's something that is common. And I think the vast majority of these transactions are already tagged day ahead. So this shouldn't be a burden. But like I said before, it provides the confidence going into real time that the accounting for imports is accurate.
So do we want to go to another question on the phone or in the room?
We have two more over the phone. So let's take one more over the phone and then we can switch back to the in-room.
Actually, Isabella, we have only one more on the phone. Caller, please go
Okay,
ahead.
Okay.
Good afternoon, everyone. This is Jeff Nelson from SCE. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, Jeff.
Yes.
Great. All the double muting, I figured that out. So I'm trying to understand the mechanics of whether this really is a problem or not. So if BAA2 knows that it's supporting some flavor of export, they're going to have to burden that in their RSE, right? They're not going to be able to count those bids as part of the supply they bring to the RSE if they have an export. So I'll phrase that as a question rather than a statement. So if going into the RSA, BAA2 knows they're exporting, question, this isn't a problem, right?
Yeah, if we have the information prior to running the Edam RSE, this whole problem goes away. The problem is maybe you have a third BAA and marketer A sources from BAA2, which is in the Edam, or BAA3, which is outside the Edam, and they're looking for where they can get additional supply, and you don't know at 10 a.m.
Okay, well, let's continue to walk that through. So let's say BAA2 doesn't know at 10 a.m. and the RSE stuff happens, great. And assume nothing changes, okay, everything's perfect. We roll into real time, and by this time they know there's an export. And it was assumed nothing else has changed, all the loads the same and stuff like that. Aren't they going to have to now fill that export in order to pass their real-time RSE?
If they would have sold it intraday, yeah, that would probably get reflected in the real-time RSE. I think the problem occurs is if BAA2 doesn't sell the residual capacity to the marketer, and it was shown for BAA1.
Okay, so now we're okay. So if BAA2 knows that there's a problem, BAA2 has got to be concerned about this because at the last minute they may have to back an export that they may not have been planning on backing. So BAA2 should be a little concerned about this happening, where they don't know about it day ahead and they thought they were fine with the RSE, and then there's an export that gets put on them intraday or after the day-ahead market clears. Now BAA2 is responsible for covering that export in its RSE. You know, California, and Michelle Keto, I think, is in the room. It's a similar flavor of the BAA being surprised that they now have an obligation they didn't think they had. Now,
yeah, I wouldn't necessarily view it as BAA2 would have to cover the export, because if they don't choose to make that sale because they don't have the capacity, then there's no export. The problem is you have an import that was shown in the EDAM RSE, which doesn't actually show up when you get to real time.
Well, we're not done yet, right? We're not done yet. So let's say that happens. BAA2 says, no, I'm not letting you export. Marketer A still has, like you said, the option to find someone that will sell them the power and get it in. It may be a non-EDAM entity, and they just find the power and they show up. And in that case, again, question mark, there's no problem, right?
That's just fine. Yeah, if they can fulfill the contract, then the import shows up. Then yeah, that would be a happy outcome.
Okay, so we're now down to the sort of the end of the line scenario where marketer A wanted to buy from BAA2 and BAA2 said no. So marketer A scrambled to find someone else to sell them the power and everyone said no. Now marketer A doesn't deliver. So it really seems like the issue is, what do we do to marketer A? What do we do to marketer A if they don't deliver? And it seems like that's where you need to be focusing your attention. Severe penalties, liquidated damages plus penalties. What do we do to marketer A if they don't deliver? Okay, that's it.
I see Mike wants to take a stab at that.
Well, first, you don't buy from marketer A anymore if they don't deliver. Second, marketer A, I mean, unless they're an EDAM entity, I think it's the BAA's responsibility. And so what we've been talking here is, yeah, the liquidated damages, BA1, we get liquidated damages from marketer A, and BA1 doesn't buy from marketer A anymore. That's kind of the reality of the situation. But I 100% agree that we should require E-tags by 3 p.m. And if they're not required by 3 p.m., the RS or the BA that was relying on that import from marketer A that can't be E-tagged by 3 p.m., now going into EIM has to remedy that. And they have to remedy it before the stuck run. And so that's what kind of Kathy and I have been talking about here is that, it's the BA's responsibility that's relying on that import. And if that import doesn't show up and isn't tagged by 3 p.m., they now have to, they're responsible to remedy that before the real-time market.
Okay, just for clarity, I want to make sure people understand that is not what I was advocating. Just for clarity, it sounds to me that you're based on the sort of the arguments I heard there. That should be up to individual balancing authorities on whether they're going to require the tagging or not. And I don't think there's any problem with an individual balancing authority saying our rule is you have to have tags in by 3 or we blacklist you. But I don't think that needs to be an EDAM rule.
So to be clear, that's what I'm advocating for, is that it is an EDAM rule.
Okay, well, I mean, let's table the tagging discussion for a little bit because we do get into that kind of later this afternoon.
Okay, but this is just helpful. I just want to put the sort of other sort of perspectives out there. And again, I focus on there's nothing wrong with EDAM. If they know in advance, everything's going to work smoothly. It's really if marketer A flakes before real-time delivery is the issue, and I think that burden falls on marketer A. Thanks.
Thanks, Jeff.
Ian with Shell Energy. And I just wanted to pick up, I think, on Mike's original point when he discussed sort of the treatment of this example. Let's just suppose that this example here is a short-term, it's a next-day sale. And marketer A is buying from marketer 2 or from BAA2 to supply to BAA1. If BAA2 makes the sale, makes a WSPP Schedule C sale, presumably that BAA is already counting that interchange as that won't be available for them to serve their own native load. BAA1 on the other side is making a purchase, So they are presumably counting on that towards their native load, either displacing their own internal generation or buying down to their max, whatever they may be doing there. So I think unless you have entities that explicitly contract for something other than WSPP Schedule C firm, such as, as available, non-firm supply, then I don't know how much, how applicable this example may be in these cases, given sort of the already existing WSPP Schedule C construct. Now, I think the second point I'd say is, I think it's something where these contracts, as we move forward and as this gels and it becomes more obvious where this is all going to go, the contracts can change in a way where the seller and the buyer on a day ahead or hourly basis can make it known in advance. This is economy energy, this is as available, it's non-firm, whatever word you want to attach, or this is firm and it's understood to be counted towards an RSE sufficiency. And I think if that's an understanding of all entities in the Edam, and there's some sort of a tagging requirement to go along with that, then I think that kind of addresses this.
Yeah, no, I think it would. I guess my next question then would be, it seems like a lot of the entities who utilize these types of contracts don't think that this is really a valid concern. And they wouldn't think it's a valid concern because there is supply that they know and can rely on kind of on the other side of these contracts. And if that's the case, what are the barriers to identifying even the source BAA where that supply is coming from at 10 a.m. rather than at 3 p.m.? Because we have a number of additional examples kind of walking through the different modeling implications of where you would actually model that supply is being sourced from. And to the extent that this is low-hanging fruit and there's the potential to evolve these contracts and know that could go a long way to figuring out how to implement these in the market.
I think one of the challenges, and it gets to the timing implications. You may know the BAA source I bought from X and don't necessarily know how the energy is going to be scheduled, whether they're generating it or they have an upstream contract and they're passing me off in the pre-schedule, sort of the pathing process. That's a consideration, but I think the issue, a major issue with identifying a BAA at 10 a.m. is just you may not be completely done with pathing and scheduling and or redirecting and arranging your transmission service. So I guess what I would say is at 10 a.m. you may this die. It did. No, it didn't. You may know the source. You may know the BAA, the BAA it's coming from. You may just not have the downstream. You may not have the transmission figured out yet. So two different lenses to look at that through.
There's the transmission side and the physical BAA side.
This is Mark. Can I just take the proposed or the solution that was discussed earlier a little bit further? So if not tagged by 3 p.m., what happens next into real time? Is it BA1 needs to make that up? And so I'm just exploring here. So what's their remedy to make it up? They go tell the marketer, find it, or I'm penalizing you because presumably that liquidated damage is in there. So they've got all the way till, I guess, 75 minutes before the hour that they have to put a schedule in. If they can't find it, balancing area one's going to have to make it up somewhere else. Versus Jeff's solution, which I think it gets practically to the same place, except he's saying the marketer gets penalized. But if the marketer gets penalized, the balancing area one is someone's still short in real time. So I'm just trying to see how these things practically converge when you get to real time, whether you tag at 3 p.m., but presumably if they don't tag, there's a consequence to somebody versus F's. he's not requiring it to tag, but he's still in real time. If he can't rely on that schedule in real time, he's not going to pass. Someone's not going to pass efficiency.
Yeah. And Mark, before we go forward, the other thing I want to point out is we are going to be utilizing these injections to optimally clear the market. So there's an existing day ahead market schedule that was predicated on that injection occurring that would then also potentially have to be unwound in real time because there's simply not going to be enough supply to meet the schedule.
So I guess my assumption is that, well, I think if you've relied on marketer A may or may not be an Edam participant. BA1 that's relied on that purchase, that Schedule C from marketer A is an Edam participant. They're the one that relied on it to pass their RSC. They're the ones that are responsible to the market and the rest of the market participants to come to Edam resource sufficient and to pass that RSC. So the responsibility now lies with them to make that right. I think T minus 75 is way too generous. It's got to be like 4 hours, T minus 4 hours. And yeah, if you have, I'll tell you at Pacificorp, our remedy would not be, marketer A, just go find it. We would book marketer A out and we would go to the intraday hour ahead bilateral market, start looking for the replacement there. But BA1 is the responsible entity that has to remedy that. And if they don't, they would file an EIM RSC at that point, in my opinion.
I think Michelle Keto in the room has to that. We can get her a mic.
So this CPUC, this really has to do with its interaction with the EIM RSC. And I'm curious because what if a marketer is using some way thinking that they're going to get a procurement out of the CAISO balancing authority, right? And so uses that to show their RSC. So then we get into the real time and, we have run the day ahead market and we have firm transfers out of the California market. And, we can go to the RSC, but, when I look at it, we support the export, which I think is a reliability issue, right? So we have basically firm intertie bids coming out, non-firm intertie bids coming in and firm exports going out. I mean, I just want to, raise these issues. I mean, they come up in the RSC as well, right? I mean, do external entities use exports out of CAISO for their balancing test? I mean, if the answer is no, great. But if it is yes, I think we have a little bit of a circle problem here.
Yes, if there's a backing resource in the CAISO BA. So if there's non-RA that we've procured under an arrangement, then it's not committed to CAISO, so it's a firm export, so it's a PT export. So in that case, absolutely, we could include it and should be able to depend on
it. Have you ever procured from a marketer who then tags out of CAISO?
No, it wouldn't happen that way, but we would be. The only way we're going to rely on an export as a firm export to count in an RSE or any kind of an RA obligation is we have to tie it to firm capacity.
And is that true of all of the EIM and EDAM
I think
entities?
Most of them don't rely on import or exports coming out of the CAISO. And, I was going to say, unfortunately, that didn't sound right, not on purpose, but, it's since bank has a long-term relationships with a lot of generators within CAISO, and we're, adjacent and embedded. And in fact, that it's a different situation, but I would say we're pretty unique as opposed to, a PAC or somebody else doesn't have those same arrangements.
Okay, but we should be able to see that, right? So somebody could go
the CAISO
to
sees it because there's a matching that occurs in cyber that ensures that the capacity that we're exporting is tied to a resource, and that resource has sufficient capacity available that's not committed to a prior RA obligation.
Okay, but CAISO could then see if an entity used a WSPP Scheduled C that ultimately tagged out of CAISO, right, in their balancing. Is that true? And does it happen? I'm just curious.
Well, so if I understand your concern, Michelle, you're saying, does any BAA ever use an LPT export that is economically cleared out of the CAISO's day-ahead process to inform their next-day plans, or do they work with third-party marketers who may use LPT exports that are cleared by the CAISO's day-ahead market to fulfill the WSPP Schedule C contract that they're relying on? And I think we heard from Kevin that bank doesn't do that, but there are other BAAs in the room, so it would be good to see
we wouldn't source out of the CAISO for any kind of an RA obligation without an actual capacity arrangement. It doesn't mean we don't export and we don't, take, do economic and self-schedules out of the ISO, but if we're using it in an RS test and if we're using it Edam, we would clearly be using a non-RA supporting resource, and we would have that capacity set aside for that very purpose.
Okay.
I don't disagree in today's world. That's what you're doing, and I respect that. But I think the scenario here is that marketer A just comes to you and says, here's WSPP Schedule C. I can't tell you where it's coming from. Would you say, well, is it coming from the ISO? They're going to say, I don't know.
Yes, we would actually say that.
What if they say they can't tell you?
I'm looking down the line because of the trade. But I think what we have learned, and I got to be real careful. I mean, what we have learned is that we do not want to source like out of an MP50 because of that very reason, and give somebody the ability to potentially double sell the capacity. And so that is how we avoid it, by having a very specific resource. Now, our experience, again, talking experience, for 20 something years, we have had non-resource specific contracts with the Northwest, and we have not experienced cuts or curtailments on those contracts. They're firm energy. And so we have every reason to expect they're going to continue to show up. And if they don't, I go back to what Mike said, that's not a business relationship that'll continue in the future. But I don't know if I answered your question.
It's actually helpful, because what it starts to tell me is that you have more granularity than we're talking about. It's not completely unknown. If you do a marketer WSPC Schedule C, you know that it's coming from the Northwest. It's not coming from California. You don't know where it's coming from in the Northwest, but it's coming from the Northwest.
Yes. So we don't have extraordinarily vague arrangements. Yeah. We know that it's sourcing from Bonneville or some very specific balancing authority, generally, and we're probably, and I'm going to look at Derek, but we're generally always going to be able to tag up by 3 p.m., right? So we are not going to have this kind of ambiguity, at least associated with, but that's just one utility. There's others that have different arrangements. I think part of when we went into this was the assumption is that WSPP Schedule C is reliable and dependable. From my perspective, it is. If it's not, and from your utility's perspective, it's not, then you shouldn't be putting it into the resource sufficiency exam. If you have any reason to doubt that that is going to show up, then you should not be using that. And there should be, I think in our comments, we talked about that. There should be a historical look. And, is that a sham arrangement? Well, hopefully not. But when we say WSPP Schedule C, if we're talking ISO it is going to be generally resource specific because it's going to be a non-RA resource. If it's coming somewhere else, it doesn't necessarily have to be resource specific, but we have a history of reliable deliveries that we're using as kind of the benchmark for what we would claim in any kind of an RSE. And we're going to be able to tag it by 3 p.m. well before that.
So I think we'll take one more question in the room and then go to the phone. I was notified there's a lot of phone calls, but Dave, you're next.
Sure, and at the risk of contradicting my company who's probably on the phone, I mean, I guess to back it up, I think we've drifted into the EIM resource sufficiency test from the Edam, because at least to my mind, the Edam, the RS test preceded the day-ahead market run. So we weren't relying on the day-ahead market to pass the day-ahead resource sufficiency test. As to the EIM test, I think you have to break the world into before the ISO changed the rules on the exports and, and after. It used to be that those exports were firm. So somebody might do a WSPP Schedule C as a marketer and somebody would buy it. But I think you changed that in like June of, 21. So at that point, it became much more non-firm. And so there's a challenge to doing that. So I think we can't just blithely say never or never happened, because it used to be fine when those were considered firm. But now the rules have changed, and clearly there's an inability to rely on exports from the ISO. They're all non-firm.
Well, unless you meet the PT criteria and it's a designated non-RA resource, then they're
correct.
Equal priority to KISO.
That the question dealt with buying out of the market, not.
Yeah. Okay.
You want to go open the wheel through? We can talk the rest of the afternoon on that.
So, I mean, my takeaway from this conversation is that it seems like part of knowing that these are going to be firm exports is having a pretty good idea where they're coming from, which again kind of strikes me as there's a potential to maybe evolve when you may know these contracts are coming from, which then really helps us in how we would model them in the market, which is coming a few slides from now. But I thought we did have some callers on the phone that we would want to give an opportunity to hear from.
Yeah, let's go ahead and take one of the callers in the queue, and then we'll come back to our in-room questions.
Okay, sure. Please go ahead. Your line is unmuted.
Yeah, thank you, Stuart Kelly, LA. I think just on identifying the source on that particular aspect, I think if we challenge ourselves to identify the source BA, that can readily be done for the most part. And then from there, having that BA at least tag that export to a particular generator, one of its facilities, I think that's probably more than doable for the most part. So that's one aspect I'd like to raise. The second one, and it really gets to Mike's point, and Mark was elaborating on this. What happens in the event that marketer A just doesn't turn up? Mike made a very interesting statement that it should be the BA that cures it, and that then leads you to say, well, what happens if they can't cure it? And I think there's a couple of things that come out of that for me. And I agree with the stuck timeline as being the absolute cutoff point by which it has to be cured, and it may bleed into the EIM, resource sufficiency evaluation test. But at a minimum, there needs to be a backstop to freeze transfers, so the burden is placed on the BA that doesn't turn up. And then that in turn leads, well, what are we doing with the failure consequences? And I know that, Danny, you're going to say that's maybe coming later on, but I'm really concerned about reliability. I think we need a backstop of freezing transfers for the very scenario that Jeff Spires brings up, because that's the most probable one to happen. And we should also then look at, the failure consequences as a result. And I don't think there's enough focus being placed on, if there is excess supply, can we make that information available, be it day ahead or between day ahead and real time, so that in the event something happens and that supply can't turn up, that information is readily available, and it's at a market price. It's not dictated by the outcome of the market. It's whatever somebody wants to bid their excess supply in and make it available, that folks could actually go to try and cure in that scenario. Because I don't believe necessarily if that doesn't turn up, that the burden should then get placed on other BAs to help cure that. It may be that particular scenario is more appropriate for a freezing of transfers.
So if I understood kind of the last part of that, Stuart, you're almost positing that there would be the ability to manually dispatch supply that was offered into the Edam through the RSC, but wasn't otherwise cleared to address intraday concerns?
Yes, exactly. Have the excess supply available at whatever price people want to market it, because we're trying to bring together a bilateral and a spot market. And if that helps people not fail. So you're in advance trying to make sure the entities don't fail. And then we can have a further discussion about what's appropriate in the event the entities do fail. And it may be the case if supply just doesn't turn up, as Mike Wildman said, it's on that entity to cure and freeze the transfers. So I just would like to see more done on the front end to help entities pass, but at a competitive price that folks are willing to make their excess supply available at.
Yeah, so the other concept I think you're kind of getting at is something that we've pitched 2 or 3 times, which was like the bid range trading model, where VAs would make their residual supply available through either a CAISO hosted almost message board or a third-party vendor hosted that would more easily facilitate transactions between Edam BAAs on a more granular basis than what's currently offered in the bilateral market. I think that's kind of what you're saying, and I think that's something that we would be interested in either helping to stand up or working with any other entity who would want to stand that up, because to the point we can make it easier to cure resource insufficiencies in the day ahead process, the better outcomes we're going to have running the market, and the more reliable the market's going to be.
Exactly, and particularly in tight, maybe summer conditions, wherever, because if you're putting a burden of a 3 p.m. tagging deadline, for the most part, that's fine. But when folks are trying to make phone calls, if there's something that makes it readily, the information available that there is excess supply and it's available, it's easier to hit those timelines of 3 p.m. But the most important part is it's tagged before stock at minimum. 3 p.m. is preferable if you gives you some time to review that, whoever's going to review it. But yes, I think I would like to see something like that developed to make it easier for entities to pass. And that, in my mind, is a step forward. And going back to my first point, another step forward is identify the source BA and ask the source BA to at least tag it to some form of generation. Because if they're in Edam, that's going to be easy. If they're not in Edam, I'm sure they can do it.
Yeah, I can even go a step farther. Like if you can't even tag it to the source resource, we can use that distributed generation aggregation point model to allocate it within the BA it would be sourced from. And as you'll see in a few slides, that leads to much better outcomes from a pricing standpoint.
And even then, I know that you don't necessarily know the path, and it could go through different BAs, but probably 9 times out of 10, you could probably say, well, I'm likely to, I don't know the specific path, but I know likely the BA is going to come through, or certainly the injection point anyway into the sync BA.
Yeah, it's really encouraging to hear that. It seems like identifying the source BA by the time we run the market is within the realm of possible.
I just test my, I think we're getting really close here, and I just want to see if my understanding is correct from what I've heard. I agree with Stuart that maybe the source BA or the cloud of source BAs is something possible and something we can work with. But at the end of the day, ahead market, there's a desire. There's a desire to have it tagged at 3 p.m. Okay, and then the question is, what if they don't tag by 3 p.m.? And what I'm hearing is, okay, if you don't tag by 3 p.m., then by stuck, you're on the pathway. If you don't replace that source, and I'm thinking about it, Stuck has to have a new process, but that's okay. Let's say Stuck has a new process, and you don't replace that source, you're on your way to having to, I guess, be out of the pool.
I think that's how you effectuate.
Okay. So you're out of the pool. Now you're heading to real-time alone. And I guess your last chance is you better get sourced up on your own, not in the pool, to pass through real-time EIM. Otherwise, you're going to feel the consequences of real-time EIM not passing. Okay.
And what happens if you don't pass because of that?
But now you're into real-time resource efficiency consequences, which we're talking about another day.
Yeah. I know, but it's all linked. It's all linked. But at minimum, if you had at least some information of what excess supply is available, it helps you cure.
If that sequence works, I think we can think about that.
Yeah.
I want to poke at Jeff a little bit because I want him to hear that sequence and see how that works in Jeff's work. If you tag at 3 p.m., all good. You stay in the pool, blah, 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 and you get the pool consequences from there on. And I think there's other things that may kick you out of the pool, but I don't want to get into all those right now.
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, I mean, effectively, it becomes a stuck tagging. It's not a day ahead tagging. Like if your consequences are based on, is this actually tagged by stuck? It's a stuck related tagging deadline, right?
Yeah. So Danny, is that making sense?
Yeah, no. I think I'm tracking. This is something we need to think about internally, but it's like a plausible path forward.
By the way, I'm looking for both Jeffs to chime in if they want.
So we have another caller in the queue, so we're going to take that one.
Sure. Caller, please go ahead. Your line is unmuted.
Hi, thanks. It's Jeff Spires here. And thanks, Mark, for kind of summarizing the discussion pretty well there. Just a few thoughts about this. So number one, I do think what others have mentioned is valid, which is the ideal is that all of these transactions, the send and the transmission is identified at 10 a.m. And I do think a sign of those contracts could be identified at that point of time, and probably that percentage will increase over time as the market evolves. But there's still this outstanding question about transactions that aren't identified. And I think, first of all, the tagging timeline needs to be crystal clear that it's 3 p.m. day ahead and not into real time. And the challenge is, what happens if somebody goes short? If you have a marketer that sells to be and goes short, what happens, as Stuart said, when they can't find? And unfortunately, the reality is that strategies of going short into the market are most likely to fail at the worst time. When system conditions are really tight on the hottest days, that's when marketer A is not going to be able to find the supply at any price, and they're not going to show up. And so a day-ahead E-tag is one proactive means to be able to identify that a source and transmission actually exists. And yes, absolutely, if an entity fails to do that, they should have to go out and scramble to try to cure that in real time. But there's a real risk they won't be able to. And so I think there's another more a related question around that, which is, if you think about what might occur here, even by 3 p.m., I mean, that's already late because the day-ahead market's already run, the unit commitment decisions have already been made. The entity that's relying on that import that's not identified might also have exports that they're supporting through the Edam solution to other BAs. So now you get into real time. Let's say you have BA 2 receiving its import that isn't supported by real resource or real transmission, and that fails to show up. Well, what if BA2 also has an export to another BA in the EDAM footprint? What's the expectation at that point? Are they able to, if they can't meet their export obligations, what happens then? Does the other BA also have to wear some of that risk of a failure to deliver on that import, or does BA2 have to hold that export firm and curtail their own load first because they had a failure of supply that they could have e-tagged and didn't? So I think there's some other questions there. The fundamental issue being that it's a real challenge to just say, well, go fix it real time, because we know that the highest risk is during those periods when that's going to be exceptionally difficult. So I think, the clarity of the requirement up front and saying the expectation is this is real and identifiable supply and transmission that's tagged, and that's what demonstrates that. A failure has to include careful consideration about what does that mean in terms of curing that real time, but also in terms of the obligations that that BA may have to others as part of the solution. And then another option, another element might be to say, look, if you don't show up day ahead with a tag, your resource sufficiency requirements go up. Effectively your uncertainty requirements go up for some period of time. So there's a more clear consequence from the test perspective as well to say, look, you have to do this. If you want to count the supply, it has to show up. You have to be able to point to where that's coming from. Because like I say, I do think that it's pretty problematic to just assume that curing it real time is possible. And I think there's significant challenges if it's not.
Okay, Jeff, I hear everything you're saying, but I'm not sure I'm getting in clarity. If at the end of the day, they end up not tagging at 3 p.m. and the balancing area 1 is responsible for it, is the consequence you're going to fail them into real time automatically, or are you going to just pull them out of the pool? I heard you saying, well, you're going to ratchet up their requirements in future days. I don't want to get into that for a second, but on that day, are you kicking them out of the pool, or are you preventing them from passing real time based on what happened and tagging 3 p.m.?
I wasn't necessarily thinking that you kick them out from a real-time test perspective. I'm much more focused on curing the insufficiency so that they don't put others within the footprint at risk. And so I think there's a couple of elements to the question. I mean, number one is, if you don't show up with a day-ahead e-tag, what are the consequences for the day-ahead EDAM test? And that's where one possibility would be to increase the uncertainty requirement on a day-ahead basis for some future day-ahead tests for some period of time. And that's one incentive to make sure that you show up with the appropriate e-tags. But I think the second part of the discussion is, if you don't show up with that e-tag and you don't have that import supply, if that leaves you in a shortfall position and you've also got export commitments to others within the EDAM, that's putting a burden on everybody. So it really matters that that entity is trying to cure that the best they can. And then I think there's kind of an outstanding question of what happens if they can't. And so those are almost all kind of independent of the real-time test. I'm much more focused on saying what steps can they take well before that, because obviously that's 40 minutes prior to the hour. What are they doing sort of from 3 p.m. onwards immediately to try to cure that issue in as quickly as possible and get themselves back in a good position, so to speak.
Thanks, Jeff. So I think my takeaway is that we want to ensure that non-resource specific supply is somewhat firmed up with a fairly reliable tag by the time we run the stuck market in the real time. I think the next caller in the queue, I think is probably Jeff Nelson, and I'd like a LSE perspective internal to the CAISO on the feasibility of this approach.
Danny, just before you move on, I just want to clarify, I don't agree with the way you recast that to a stuck requirement. What I said before, just to clarify, is I think it has to be crystal clear that the expectation and the requirement is day ahead, because once you leave it to real time, you're already putting it at risk. You're already in a situation where you're not sure whether or not you're going to be successful in curing that. And So making it very clear it's a day-ahead requirement, not a stuck requirement. I just wanted to clarify my position on that.
Yeah, I guess yes. I understand that's your position. I think some of the other positions in the room have been stuck would be when you'd expect it to be cleared up or there'd be ramifications. And to me, if the penalties would start at stuck for not having it, then effectively day ahead is great. I think we want to know this as much as possible, as soon as possible. But again, you would advocate for day ahead. Others may advocate for stuck, but I'd like to hear maybe some of the California BAA LSEs about what might be workable from their perspective.
We had a phone go off. Sorry for those people on the phone.
Oh, okay.
So, hi, this is Marcy Palms from Southern California Edison. So thanks for this conversation. It's been interesting hearing all the different perspectives. So I have a real problem just completely dismissing megawatts because they are not tagged by 3 p.m. Now, the way that our process works, we're tagging more than 90%, probably close to 99% of our resources are tagged in the day-ahead market before 3 p.m. But there are certainly valid instances where there's a resource that is tagging after that and even into the real-time market. So to completely dismiss those seems like we're leaving megawatts on the table. And to make that a requirement, when it seems like that is certainly a practice right now in the market. And again, that's something that we strive to do as well. It's not a requirement under our contracts to do that, but it is something that we work with the ISO on, and that's what we do. But there are, again, very valid reasons why somebody might buy economic transmission in the real-time market, and we tag those up in real time. So to completely just take those off the table and dismiss those, I think that just puts us in a bad position. So I think the stuck requirement that you're talking about, at least taking a look at that point in time, is something that we could work toward.
Okay, that's what I was going to ask Marcy, is that based on what you've heard, and I appreciate you saying that there's a large percentage that do get tagged, but if there's something doesn't, does the pathway to remedy and resolution through a stuck time frame process, is that something you could consider?
I think that's something we could consider, yes. Okay, so we have one more over on the left side of the room, and then we'll go to Carrie.
Hello, my name is Oscar Herrera. I'm with the Los Angeles Department of Water and Power. Fascinating topic. The more I think about this with regards to the timing and tagging, it's almost like there's already a partial solution that exists today. Let's take actually today as an example. Trades in the bilateral market for Wspc contracts are being conducted for both Friday and Saturday. For Saturday, tags would be issued by 3 p.m. today. So for RSC tomorrow morning, we would already have those tags completed. So then tomorrow morning, when we start getting ready for prepping ourselves for the RSC test, whether we need to buy additional bid range capacity or whatever eloquent market products are out there, we would already have those tags in. We would already have our schedules in and so forth, and those tags would already be incorporated, and we would know what the transmission commitments are, and we know what the energy commitments are. And this is typically what's done for multi-day transactions. It's not necessarily something that occurs all the time. Obviously, for the weekends, this does occur. But just thinking outside of the box, in those types of instances, maybe we can possibly looking at the bilateral market and extending that timeline so both the bilateral market and the EDAM can coexist, per se. That's all I have. Thank you.
That's an interesting perspective. I mean, that kind of proves that where there's a need, which is the weekend, and not doing this next day over the weekend, there's a path forward to having more specificity on these contracts.
Okay, we'll take Carrie's question in the room and then we will move on with the slides because we do have a fair amount of material to still get through for today.
Carrie Bentley with the Western Power Trading Firm. I had a quick question for Mike before we moved on the proposal. When you were saying that it would be the BAA's responsibility if it wasn't tagged, did you mean if that made you short of the RSE test, or did you just mean if the tag failed? Because I can imagine there's a lot of times you're going. So is it only when that tag would make you short? Or is it really you're willing to at all times just make it up because you committed that capacity?
Yeah, that's a good question. I said that I was initially thinking that if you relied on an import, a Schedule C import into your BA to pass your RSC, and then that was unable to be tagged, and now you are not able to pass your RSC, then yes, you are responsible for that. That's what I was initially thinking, but yeah.
I think that's a really important distinction.
Yep.
Yeah. And then I had another kind of proposal of my own. Later in your slides, you propose maybe percentages. So maybe the rule is, you have to have your source and transmission and tagged all by 3 p.m., but only 95% of it. You allow a little buffer as we evolve our contracts to be tagged later. But, you say, according to SCE, maybe they have 95% all the time. They can count on that. So all E-tags by, or 95% of E-tags by 3 p.m. Just think there's a lot of wiggle room we could have at least in the first few years of Edam.
Yeah, it's a really good way that we could phase this one in, Carrie. Thank you. Okay. Oh, do we have one more? Or can we table this for now? Oh.
Sorry, I think we're making good progress. I know that you want to move on,
okay.
But I think we're making good progress here.
Matt will be right back here, ready.
Yeah.
Fair.
No, I think there are some ways to phase into it, and I think an important question that was raised is essentially at what point do you get, and I don't have a solution or an answer to this, but what point do you get kicked out of the Edam RSC pool, right? At 3 p.m., if you don't have something tagged, is that just kind of a warning? You don't have it tagged, you have till stuck, and then at stuck you get kicked out, or do you get kicked out at 3 p.m. and are on your own at that point? So I think that's one thing to consider as well. Is there a percentage, something that we can phase into? Yeah, so that was it.
Okay, I think we have Michelle. It's been patiently waiting.
So this is going to sort of lead into the next topic, but are you imagining that you would require the interties to tag as well? Because the interties support the exports that then go into the RSE. And then another question is, how is this going to mesh with the EIM RSE? So we're going to require stuck tags for Edam entities going into the EIM RSE, but not require it for the EIM entities. And I do think you have to think about the difference. And also, I just will go to the fact that I keep on going back to this point, but if you're requiring CAISO to bring the E-tags for its RSE, but you don't require the interties to bring their E-tags on which exports firm transfers could be allowed. And I know everyone's isn't as concerned about this, but this is a particular reliability issue for California, right? Because no other entity has intertie bidding at its border that facilitates transfers out of its system. And so I just think we have to keep focused on that, because I don't want to create a huge reliability concern for California as a result of this. So thanks.
Yeah, thanks, Michelle. I think your concern is founded with California ISO's unique position with looking to allow intertie bidding and then having Edam transfers, which we are aspiring to have equal priority to load, but we're still trying to work through how we cannot have that be a reliability concern. I do think you provided a really good transition to the next topic, and it gets into what are the potential impacts due to a lack of source specificity on how these would be modeled and considered in the market. So back to my somewhat confusing example. BAA1 signs a supply contract for 100 megawatts with marketer A. Marketer A sources that 100 megawatts from supply from a pool of resources in BAA2. Maybe you even know it's coming from BAA2 and you can adjust the counting and you're not having any double counting issues. And they identify the injection point into BAA1. There are a couple of different ways to handle this when we're actually going to run the market. So the first option would be if no BAA to BAA transmission is required and you're not actually modeling this in the market, this is just an injection. The result is that you probably get less reliability assurance that that's actually going to be deliverable in real time. You can get around this by modeling this in the market, right? We would want to try to model these types of injections in the market. If you include these injections in congestion management, then they're part of the optimal solution. I know previously we proposed optionality on these Wspp injections being self-scheduled or a requirement. Even if you go to optionality, if they're self-scheduled into the market, then they're going to be competing for potentially limited transfer capacity across these ties with all of the bids and schedules that are economically offered into the market who are trying to use the buckets 1, 2, and 3 transmission. If they're self-scheduled, it's not unreasonable to say that they would almost have a Edam market clearing priority, since the market will look to not move off those self-scheduled injections if there are economic supply offers that could be dispatched around them. So I want to pause here, and it seems like we made a lot of progress on identifying source specificity and having some type of tag. This really gets to what should be the transmission requirements at the boundaries to BAAs that would be looking to utilize these Wspp supply contracts to try and figure out how these slot in with the rest of the transmission that would be optimally used by the market.
So Danny, I think I'm following everything, but why couldn't we use that same model that we just went through as the solution? Because if you get the tag at 3 p.m., you got the transmission resolved.
Well,
does it differ? I guess it differ.
I think it's no. To me, it's the same timing issue, because we would need to know it by 10 a.m. when we're running the market. The boundary transmission.
So we've got kind of the source specificity resolved a little bit by the balancing area idea, or some cloud of balancing area. You're saying if they can't specify the transmission at 10 a.m. Is that right?
Yeah. If it's not known, I think we'd want to model it as part of congestion management. But if it's not known and it's not pre-procured, it's almost getting a super priority in the market clearing process against the conventional buckets transmission.
Don't say that, because
I retract.
No, I'm just thinking out loud here, and I don't. We should open up to the discussion, make sure we understand the problem.
So I think we did have some more callers in the queue. Are they still there, Shreyas?
Yes, they're in the queue. I see 2 callers right now. Actually, 3. Moving on to the first caller. Please go ahead. Your line is unmuted. Please accept the message to become unmuted and proceed with your question.
Okay, maybe we'll come back to that one.
Okay, going on to the next caller. Please go ahead. Your line is unmuted.
Hi there. It's Mark Holman with PowerX. I thought this has been a great discussion, and including this latest slide and example. But it seems to be there's something that we're dancing around with here and not quite hitting the nail on the head in terms of, where do you draw the line on what supply should be included or not included? And I think it's really important to crystallize that. So I think what I'm hearing is most stakeholders agree that if you have a contract with someone who has identified supply and has transmission, maybe they can't tag it until 3 p.m. day ahead, but that should be included. It's real supply, it's real transmission. I think if you go to the other end of the spectrum and you say you've got a contract with a marketer, and let's use the end of the spectrum, and the marketer tells you, I don't have any supply yet, I don't have any transmission yet, I hope to buy it in real time, and I hope to buy the transmission in real time. Should we be including that as supply in the resource efficiency evaluation? And part of what I think I was hearing was, well, yes, we should, as long as they happen to show up and they're successful in that bet. And I think we don't want to include that supply. And I think that's kind of what's getting at this day-ahead tagging issue. If we're not requiring a day-ahead tag by 3 p.m., then what we're probably saying is we're going to have some BAs that are going to include supply from marketers who don't have any supply and or they don't have any transmission, but they hope to buy it in real time. And as long as they are successful in real time, we're going to call it no harm, no foul. And I think that's the heart of this issue and why the day-ahead tag is so important, because as soon as you slip that day-ahead tagging requirement, what it really means is we're going to let people just include resource sufficiency supply that's just a promise from a marketer to hope to go find it. And they may be successful day after day until they're not. And then what do? And I think we all want to see reliability maintained. We all want that BA1 to shore that up. But what if BA1 can't? And they now have 1,000 megawatts of exports to, let's just say, BA2 and BA3. And BA2 and BA3 had units that could have started up. They didn't buy gas. They didn't start those up. Whose load gets curtailed? Is it BA1? Is it BA2 and 3? Is it pro rata across the footprint and now BA2 and 3 are wearing the reliability consequence of BA1's IOU from a marketer? And I think that's the heart of the issue is, are we intending to include supply that is real and identifiable and transmission that has been procured? Maybe it's not tagged till 3 p.m. Or are we going to slip that and say, no, it usually shows up. That marketer's usually good for it. It's okay to include supply that's not secured or transmission that's not procured because they have a pretty good track record. And I think those lead to very different reliability outcomes on critical days. And that's the lessons that have been learned around the West in the last couple of years. And part of what has led the RAP program to say we need to have a foundation of identifiable supply and transmission secured for resource adequacy supply. Doesn't mean you can't go buy the other supply for economic displacement. But if you're going to include it as resource adequacy or resource sufficiency supply, we want it to be real. And I think that we just need to be really crystal clear on that. And, I really appreciated the comments of Mike Wilding and Kevin Smith, because I think the difference is for entities that contract with someone and use that for resource sufficiency or resource adequacy supply today, if that marketer doesn't show up with a day-ahead tag, a lot of times they'll stop transacting. They'll say, that doesn't work for me anymore. You sold me something you didn't have. You couldn't show up with a day-ahead tag. I don't want to buy that from you anymore. You seem to think an IOU and a hope that you can procure it in real time is okay. That doesn't work for me. And I think the CAISO can't easily do that. You're an organized market with intertype bid. You just can't say, well, we're not going to take that from them anymore. But I think the heart of this issue is whether we're really going to go to all BAs, including the CAISO BA, actually showing up with real identifiable supply and transmission for RSE supply, or whether we're just going to take an IOU and as long as they happen to show up, it's okay.
Yeah, thanks, Mark. I think you identified one bound and potential outcome of this, which would be everything is fully tagged in the day ahead timeframe. I think our challenge is to figure out if that's the right approach for this group as a whole and if that works for all potential BAs. I think I even heard from Kevin earlier that they source stuff from the Northwest and don't necessarily know exactly where it's coming from, but it's always reliable and it has been for years. And I think under what you're positing, even that type of WSPP Schedule C may not meet the standards of this. So I think
I'm not saying that at all. I'm saying that
what am I missing?
I'm quite familiar with what Kevin and everyone else buys in the rest of the West. And what I'm saying is you need to look at WSPP Schedule C, and they're transacting with counterparties. If they're going to use that, and Kevin, please correct me, but if anyone's going to use that to maintain their reliability and as resource adequacy or resource sufficiency supply, they're going to expect that that supplier shows up with a day-ahead tag, actually has supply and transmission. If that entity says, well, no, I don't, and I'm going to try to find it in real time and I don't have a tag, I think what Kevin and others were commenting, we're saying that's not acceptable to them. So we're not trying in any way to exclude supply from any participant that actually has supply and has secured transmission. And that's why the West of the West uses a day-ahead tag. And I think as soon as you say we don't need a day-ahead tag anymore, what you're really saying is a promise from a marketer that is going to go try and buy that supply in the real-time market or buy that transmission in the real-time time frame is okay. And where does that end? Is it okay for other entities to simply have a promise from a marketer to go buy some supply or buy some transmission and include it in the RSE? I mean, we can go back and look at the history. This is not small quantities. We've seen very significant failures going into the CAISO BA on critical days of day-ahead awards in past years. And again, I come back to my second point. If that results in Edam exports to other BAs, and now you can't make it up, whose load gets curtailed?
Mark, I think the solution that we kind of walked through, I think addressed that. You're out of the pool, you're on your own. You have to pass the test yourself, so that means you have to bring your own supply in. If you don't do that, then you're subject to real-time sufficiency failure.
So, Mark, my question was, what happens to your day-ahead exports? Not the real-time. You have a real-time sufficiency failure, but let's just use a hypothetical. Let's say you had 1,000 megawatts of imports that weren't tagged day-ahead, and that BA ends up having 600 megawatts of Edam exports to other BAs. And that 1,000 megawatts doesn't show up and you fail the RSE. Are those other BAs load now exposed to curtailment if we get into that terrible situation? Or is the BA that included supply that never got tagged, are they going to curtail their load first and keep their exports whole because they were the one who included supply that wasn't real? And I'm not advocating, I'm just saying that's not a real-time RSE issue. It's you've now given day-ahead Edam exports to other BAs that might have decommitted units because you had import supply that wasn't tagged, never showed up, and you couldn't cure the deficiency. So I think that is separate and distinct from now having a freezing or a financial consequence in the EIM. It's who's bearing the reliability risk if those imports never show up.
And yeah, I think we've been, Mark, pretty clear so far that our whole construct here is that it would be equally borne pro rata based on the load and the BAA giving the transfer, and then a portion of that would be haircut out of the transfer out. This is a potential occurrence if non-resource specific supply doesn't show up, but this is also potentially can occur if large resources trip offline and in the real-time time frame, everybody carries contingency reserves to replace their MSSC. Your ability to replace that MSSC if something happens intraday, 6 hours before, maybe you're whole, maybe you can replace, and maybe you're whole from a reserve perspective, or maybe you're not. So this is a little bit broader topic that you're bringing up on just what is the appropriate confidence in Edam transfers.
I think I'm distinguishing it, Danny.
Today, I'm not trying to parse this out, but we were not prepared today to talk about the how you build the confidence of, and the sequence of events that can happen between day ahead, real time, bringing in your emergency supply and all that before you get to that point of having to consider load shed. I think we were going to have that discussion. I think
end of the month, 26, 27.
Okay, that was in 26. And I want to have that discussion, but I need to have this discussion first so I can really understand all the moving pieces, so I can answer your question, Mark. I'm not trying to avoid the question, but I don't want to answer it today without understanding all the other moving pieces before that.
I appreciate that, Mark, and I wasn't asking for an answer. I was saying that I think the question gets raised, and it's something for you to think about when you come back. I fully understand pro rata curtailment amongst a group of entities that are all bringing real deliverable supply, meeting a same standard. That's something we've long supported. I think it's you got to think about it a little bit differently. If somebody is showing up there with supply that's not real or deliverable and with some promises, and then those promises don't show up, I think something you should think about is, and I'm not advocating one way or the other, I just think you need to think about that differently. And I just disagree with Danny. It's not the same as someone having units trip offline or your load coming in high. Those are generally random events. Everyone's exposed to them. You all share in the pain. If someone's bringing in supply that's not real, and then others got to bear the consequence of that behavior, I just put that in a different category for you to contemplate.
I hear you, Mark. I think as Mark up here said, we plan to address this at a future workshop. So thank you for your comment.
We do only have about 45 more minutes left to get through the content that we have scheduled for today. So let's continue with the slides and then take questions again at the end, but we do need to move on.
I do want to say I'm appreciative of this discussion, and I'm appreciative of the honest dialogue going on here. I know we're probably running out of time and we're not getting through it, but we're making progress, and I don't want to lose track of the fact that we're doing. If we rush through the material just to get through the material without making progress, it's all for naught anyway. So I do want to allocate the time to have these discussions and get clarity about where the tension points are.
On that note, do we just want to see if there's more discussion that needs to be had on this item before we move on?
Do we have some more people on the phone?
Yes, I do see a couple of callers on the phone line. Please go ahead, your line is unmuted.
Good afternoon, this is Tom Burns from Pacific Corp. Can everyone hear me?
Yes.
Okay. So I tend to agree with Mark and Jeff in principle about quite a few things. However, if there is a marketer, or if we are counting WSPP contracts as supply to pass the RSE, and for whatever reason something fails to materialize, I'm going to make the recommendation that if there is excess capacity, that entity is not removed from the pool, but rather there is a penalty price that is imposed to be levied against the entity that did not show up with that WSPP Schedule C contract. And that will discourage anybody from showing up with false or that IOU type supply. At that point, the Edam entity will be able to levy that against that entity that didn't show up, and not have that entity be rewarded with whatever the LMP is in real time, and have that be the settled consequence for them, but rather have that hard and fast penalty to be able to discourage that type of behavior. Now, if there's scarcity on that day, I agree with Mark. There needs to be a much further question about how that is managed. But I am going to advocate very strongly that we don't kick anybody out of the pool, but rather there be consequences. and either way, whether there be scarcity or not be scarcity, that this needs to go into the RSE uncertainty component. And, that's a penalty that the BAA, the Edam entity, is going to incur because they have some culpability in this as well, because they have a responsibility to make sure that all of those E-tags are appropriately approved for the appropriate products and that there is not firm tags that are approved and slipped into the resource plan. So I'll stop.
Thanks, Tom.
there.
I think we have considered an uncertainty adder previously, and I think one of the reasons we didn't at least initially go out with it as part of this process is we literally just removed it from the WEIM RSC because it was found to not be very representative of future uncertainty. So again, I think this is something we'd be open to, but we'd have to figure out how to do this that doesn't run into those same problems of having uncertainty requirements that are driven by very small sample sizes that really are trying to capture outlier events that aren't then predictive of normal uncertainty. So open, but a little
completely
hesitant
agreed.
on this idea.
The WEIM is measuring something different. The NSI measure for WEIM is measuring something different and has a lot of timing requirements that were out of sync. When we're talking about a day-ahead market run, it would be very obvious what shows up and what does not show up.
Oh yeah, no. I think it's obvious what shows up and what doesn't show up. The issue is the issue to me is what drives those occurrences of not showing up. And it's typically kind of outlier events. This stuff doesn't get delivered on a hot, low day, or there's a fire, but then that event ends up influencing the adder for a prolonged period of time. So
agreed. All nuances that can be worked out.
Yeah. And that's why I think we'd be open to it, but I think we need to be a little cautious figuring out if that's a good way to account for these types of contracts.
But it's the penalty price that is associated with that failure to show up. If there's a commitment from an IOU marketer that fails to show up, if the consequence is just real-time LMP settlements, that's not really going to discourage, and as a matter of fact, it might oftentimes encourage that type of behavior.
I think we could take this a step farther, and we kind of highlight this at the very end in the pooled RSC or in the failure consequences section, which we'll talk about tomorrow. But there's also a concern that you don't want just a bid cap hourly energy price to be an out to avoid procuring very expensive energy for a peak block through one of these fictitious contracts in a day ahead basis. So that there is an interplay with the WEIM RSC and even how we would try to assess a financial consequence in that time frame that we will have to think through and make sure anything we do in Edam doesn't create the wrong set of incentives.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, we'll take the next question in the queue.
Sure. Please go ahead. Your line is unmuted.
Hi, this is Todd Ryan with Pacific Gas and Electric. Just one point that I haven't heard anyone mention yet is that my understanding is that the 3 p.m. deadline is coincidental with the WEC tagging deadline, which is a soft deadline because, sometimes markets, the day ahead market run takes longer to solve or whatever. And so I would look at a minimum to hope that any kind of hard or soft requirement has enough flexibility to accommodate those changes in schedule.
Yeah. I think we'd agree that 3 p.m. deadline is as currently instituted in the Western Interconnection is not a hard deadline for all entities. For some it may be, but definitely not all.
And you would recommend that if you were to institute a tagging deadline for these contracts, that you would allow a certain degree of flexibility, say if the day-ahead market solve took longer.
Well, and I think kind of even going back to what Kerry raised earlier is maybe there is thresholds of the volume of the BAs utilizing, that would have to have a day ahead tag versus then a stuck tag, then versus maybe even what gets tagged at T40 or T57.5 for EAM BAs or T40 for the ISO. But like there are opportunities to have flexibility built into this if that's the direction we want to go.
I may be asking a stupid question here, but if you don't make the 3 p.m. tagging deadline, can you tag at 4 p.m. still, or that's no longer available? Okay. So you theoretically could do a, whatever, 2 hours, 3 hours after market publication, theoretically.
Thank you.
Thanks, Todd.
Do we have any other callers on the phone?
I do not see any other callers on the phone as of now.
Do we have any questions or comments here in the room? Okay, we have one. Let's get the mic over.
This is Michelle Keto from CPC. I know this is sort of an outlier event, but I do want to think about the potential consequences. So, I mean, I think we thought about this a little bit in the EIM RSE, but this really gives potentially marketers and people that are selling quite a bit of power. They could fail to tag. You could fail the RSE. You could then have to pay $2,000. So I do think we have to think about it holistically. I believe the Market Surveillance Committee addressed this in the RSE. If people have incentives to potentially get an entire BA to fail, right?
Yeah, no, I agree, Michelle, that this is a two-sided equation, and the solution has to work for potential Edam parties as well as the CPUC and the LSCs within California. So I think this is a concern that we are trying to balance.
Okay, and in terms of your failure consequences, I guess that does. I mean, it'll be really important to discuss that because the question is a failure going to be for the amount that fails? And it sort of feels like you guys aren't going there. It's actually going to clear the market of that. So it's a potentially very, very, very costly failure. So we really have to get this right, and there should be no sort of mistaken failures. So I do think this merits further discussion. Thanks.
We want to make this as accurate as possible, which is, I think, why we had even that first topic today of figuring out what's the acceptable level of accuracy.
Any other questions from the room? Any over the phone?
I do not see any callers on the phone.
Okay.
Okay. I then can move on to the second half of the challenge of the lack of source specificity on these types of contracts. And it's really, how does the CAISO actually model these in the market? And I think the discussion that we've had already and are kind of coalescing towards source BA goes a long way towards solving this problem, but I think it's worth at least running through what the modeling implications are, which can maybe help to crystallize that as a good solution we all want to drive to. And we've talked about wanting to include these in congestion management. So to do that, you have to distribute and source the supply that's on the other side of these contracts from somewhere. In the straw proposal, the CAISO put out that we would source this from the neighboring BAA. You at least know the scheduling point where the title of the power is transferring from. So if you use the neighboring BA, to us, that was as accurate as a guess as any. This at least models some of the flow over those internal lines, which gives a better assurance of deliverability and would make the day-ahead market look somewhat more like the real-time market from a power flow perspective. Is this a reasonable guess, or I see head shaking? No, this isn't great. And yeah.
Which BA, which neighbor are you gonna? I mean,
Well, I think what we were thinking is if the California ISO had a contract flowing in through El Dorado and APS is the BA on the other side of it, you might, or actually El Dorado's in Nevada, right? You would model it as being sourced from Nevada. That was our initial stab at how you could do this. But there are real downsides, because if these are really small volumes, okay. But if you have 1,000 megawatts of these and you have 50 generators in the neighboring BA and each of them has their output incremented up 20 megawatts, that's going to start to affect power flow, which then affects congestion, which then affects day-ahead prices, which is obviously the drawback.
So what do you do with mid-C?
What
do you do with mid-C?
Well, that's the kind of the permeation on the next slide.
Okay, all right.
About how we might want to handle this. So this is at least where the CAISO's been. To us, when we put out the straw proposal 6 weeks ago, this was the best of a number of not ideal options. The next slide is another option that we considered, and this was distributing the injection quantity to all generators in the network model. Maybe you just source it from everywhere. This is good in the sense that it minimizes the impact on any particular BAA. It's bad because then your congestion in the day ahead looks even farther off what you'd actually expect to see in the real time. So bad from a congestion offset standpoint. The bullet here on the bottom is something we've started to bat around internally, is if you didn't have BAA source specificity, could you at least distribute it somewhat zonally based off the geographic location of the sink BAA? So if you're Idaho and you have a Wspp, no matter where it's coming from, rather than modeling it as just coming from your direct neighbor, maybe you model it from all the BAAs who regularly trade through mid-C, for example. So you model it as distributed to the northwestern section of the footprint. You could have a similar setup for the southwestern section with maybe the Palo Verde hub as the basis. This is just an idea. Again, I don't think that this is that great of an idea, because to us, where we've been trying to get to, and it seemed like the optimal outcome is to identify the source BAA. If you identify the source BAA where this is coming from, then when you are distributing those injections, even absent the specific resource, the flow in that internal BAA will look somewhat like it will when you get to real time. And obviously the whole point of having or one of the objectives of a day-ahead market is to try to capture real-time outcomes and schedule them accurately in the day ahead. The con here is that this does require an evolution of these types of contracts, which it seems like there's some willingness to move forward towards. The last bullet is what I tried to talk about on the previous topic, is should bucket one transmission be required to count these in the Edam RSC, or as part, or to utilize them in the market. I mean, if going back to that previous example, CAISO, APS, and PNM are all in the Edam, and you know that the source is going to be in PNM, and you know that the sink is going to be the CAISO BAA, do you have some type of boundary transmission requirement to count these, and make sure you're not oversubscribing those ties, especially knowing that you know the source BAA. This is a slide kind of talking about, again, why we thought knowing the source BAA would be good, which I think we've all kind of arrived at it would be good. The bottom was an idea to try to limit the volumes of these contracts that are just completely unsource specific. This was both to somewhat address the confidence concern, if these would be overcounted, as well as to address the pricing accuracy concern that if you have really significant volumes of these, you could create. I think from hearing what Carrie said earlier, maybe there's a hybrid approach where you have certain percentages of these that would have tagging requirements at different timelines to try to increase the accuracy when we're actually running the day-ahead market itself. These were other ideas that we had. The first bullet is kind of what Stuart Kelly brought up, is there the opportunity to make curing some of these insufficiencies a little bit easier. Could BAAs make their surplus supply on an hourly basis, and the price they're willing to take for that capacity available on almost like a very fancy message board for willing buyers to maybe try to procure. There is the potential to only consider forward contracted resource specific supply. I think we've heard that advocated for today. This may not be consistent with at least our reading of the comments of we should count all of the WSPP supply that we can, since this naturally is not inclusive of the full set of WSPP Schedule C supply. The other option that we heard is some sort of attestation appropriate. This one I'm a little bit leery of, because I think then you're having to get into the monitoring game and then figuring out what your enforcement if somebody's violating their attestation is. So to the point we can do this through correct incentives, through like the financial consequences and different tagging requirements at different deadlines, I think that's a better option. I think that we've kind of skipped over this slide having a lot of meaning. This next slide is getting back to the day-ahead e-tags, and we've had part of this discussion, but I think it's worth opening up again. The one thing that I was always confused of is what is having it at 3 p.m. get you versus some later period of time if the objective metric is making sure that supply shows up and is actually there in real time. That's at least the prism I've always thought of this through. I think what I've heard is, well, some entities think that this would be a kind of a gold standard and a good way to do things. There may be time periods later when tagging requirements would be appropriate that could offer the same type of assurance of these non-resource specific supply contracts. The bottom bullet is if we do want to monitor these, rather than developing consequences at the outset for non-performance, is there the potential to see if these are actually non-performing and then develop consequences at a later date. The final slide I have is I do want to take this a little bit back to a comment that Mark Holman made earlier, that non-resource specific supply is fundamentally different than outages on generating units. And I would push back and question that. If, from what I understand, the concern is non-resource specific supply doesn't show up on very tight supply conditions, very tight days. You know what else gets started on really tight supply days? Really, really old resources that only get started once or twice a year that are not as reliable as the rest of the fleet. So I think if we want to have an honest conversation about the capacity that is being used to clear the real-time showing up and read it in the real-time market, I don't think we can completely ignore the fact that the same resources that are going to be utilized on those peak conditions may have some inherent, or may not have the same level of reliability as resources that would be used during more conventional times. So I don't have a solution to this, but I at least want to throw this out there as a topic to consider. And then again, what's the difference between a WSPP supply contract not showing up for 100 megawatts in a really tight day and a 600 megawatt thermal resource that gets started twice a year tripping offline once it gets its day ahead schedule and is not there in real time? I think if you're really driving towards having supply show up in real time, you probably also have to at least think about the type of supply that is the type of physical supply that's actually being offered. So I want to pause there, I think, and see if there's any questions. I think we have about a half hour left, so we can either talk about this or go back to the first topic, but I do see we have a question in the room.
Hi, Carrie Bentley with the Western Power Trading Forum. Can we go back to the modeling? I had a proposal that I wanted to see if y'all were interested in.
This one?
Yeah, or option one, any of the options.
Okay.
Or actually go to maybe option, 2. Yeah.
Okay.
Grade 22. So this is addressing, I think, 2 instances. One where maybe you know the source at 10 a.m., but you don't know the transmission or the exact location, and then one where you don't know the source at all. So to me, it seems like you should have two different solutions for those different scenarios. One where the Edam entities think they have a good guess on the source. You should use the guess and model that as close as possible. Distribute it to all generation in the zone or the BAA. And that seems like your best guess. But I was wondering, maybe if you don't have any idea, you could look at historic real-time flows in and out of the BAA and just use those flows. It seems like you kind of will get a pattern over time on real-time flows, and you can make a good guess, or at least a better guess on where these non-specific resources are coming from than just assuming it's like your neighbor.
You would, if you did that, you would know that it comes through the neighbor. And then I guess the next question is, are you assuming that it came from the neighbor, or is it getting passed through from a different BAA upstream? Like, I'm just trying to kind of on the fly work through how you'd isolate where the ultimate injection was.
Yeah, I think you would have to develop a methodology, but I think it might make sense to use some sort of historic data rather than just assuming it comes from the geographic neighbor.
Yeah, no. So you're almost thinking this more holistically. Look at the footprint. What is the typical dispatches on similar days, and then try to allocate out the non-resource specific injection to make it look more like the observable generation patterns. Okay, I think I understand the concept.
Yeah, in the absence of, if you have no information, you might as well at least look at data rather than guessing. But I don't know, maybe it's not as good. Just a thought. Thanks.
No, this is, we're all about having options to try to do this.
I think Jeff Nelson is on the line and has a similar question.
Yes, please go ahead. Your line is unmuted.
Great. Thank you for calling on me, Jeff Nelson, FCE. I just wanted to sort of expand a little bit on Carrie, because that was my same thought on this modeling issue. What information do you have after the fact? Because this feels a lot to me like load forecasting. You have a lot of similar days. You have certain inputs, some sort of whatever neural learning model. It kind of knows. It's not like people are putting new generators up overnight and taking them away. So I'd really ask the ISO to look at what information you do have sort of after the fact, and how that information can be used to build a predictive model. That's all, but very similar to Carrie's comments. Thanks.
No, I think that comment makes a lot of sense, Jeff. Thank you.
Do you have anyone else on the phone?
Yes, I do see one more caller in the queue. Please go ahead. Your line is unmuted.
This is Tom Burns with Pacific Corp. I do want to address something that I think might be a fundamental misunderstanding for quite a few of the potential EDAM participants. And that is, as members of the Western Power Pool, a failure of a WSPP Schedule C import to arrive is not a qualifying event, where a failure of a rickety old resource to start is a qualifying event and allows us to draw upon the shared resources of the Western Power Pool. And I'm just based upon the conversation, I'm not sure that that's a understood thing.
No, yeah, that's a very helpful clarification, Tom. So to repeat it, to make sure we're all on the same page, the idea is that you're not going to be able to utilize your reserves to backfill a economy energy injection not showing up, which is fair.
Correct. The only thing, I mean, it's a very limited, well, I'm not going to say it's very limited. It's a very well-defined set of circumstances that we are allowed to deploy our resources for contingency reserves.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah. Yes.
Any other callers in queue?
I do not see any other callers in the queue as of now.
Do we have any questions or comments from our in the room attendees?
Well, it seems like we've talked WSPP Schedule C contracts to death. So that's a good thing, because I think it feels to me at least like we've moved the ball forward, that there is the potential for these to evolve, and that we can design a methodology that would have different potential tagging requirements at different deadlines for these WSPP Schedule C contracts, which the net outcome is we probably have greater confidence that these are going to show up and the solution will be reliable. And then from a modeling perspective, we would be able to better model these in the actual market. So thank you, everybody. This has been a really productive. Oh, I do see one more question from Marcy.
So I just wanted to follow up. Michelle had made this comment earlier, because you've been focused on just WSPP contracts, C contracts, and we contract under other, universal agreements, industry standard agreements. So I want to make sure that when you're saying WSPP, you mean really any contracted.
Yeah. We do. We have a slide later, I think, that we're going to go over tomorrow, and we would look for the CAISO BA to count any WSPP Schedule C Type R injections or any other forward contracted intertie bids. And we would look, I think, to have like a flag in cyber that associates the intertie bid with a forward contract to count it.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Firm energy contract.
Since I've heard the words brainstorm and dumb and all that stuff before, I'm gonna try and sort of supplement what Oscar brought up. How much of a leeway do we have to try and work with the WEC timeline that exists right now? It seems like a lot of problems exist because we're trying to run the optimization 10 a.m. and then get the tagging deadline and tagged all the tags in by 3 p.m. How about we look at modifying the WEC timeline so the tags in today for 3 p.m. and not for tomorrow, but the day ahead after that. And this way we don't actually have the problem to begin with.
I think that kind of falls under what's the opportunity for these to evolve. If there's widespread support to move off that existing deadline and get more information sooner, and all the parties who we'd be looking to go forward with Edam with are comfortable with that, I think that's an option. But I would, again, defer to how that impacts the business practices of both the potential Edam BAs as well as the California ISO LSEs.
That makes sense. Should we actually have that as an option here, at least, and see if we have some leverage, some weight behind that?
Yeah, I think that we could look to at least take we're not accepting, I think, written comments on the workshops. So the next opportunity would be, I think, to have a question in the template we put out after the revised straw proposal, kind of fielding what would that look like for the different potential participants in the Edam.
And I do think we had another caller enter the queue, so let's go ahead and take that one.
Caller, please go ahead. Your line is unmuted.
Hi, this is Tom Wu from WAPA. I want to bring another aspect of this problem to your attention, which may be even a solution for your modeling problem. Now, I think WSPP tagging, the main problem with tagging is the transmission, not the source and sink. Just, based on my experience, you probably know the source and sink even before 10 a.m. or by 10 a.m. But it may take some time to sort out the transmission. And maybe you had a plan to use certain transmission, and then there are derates. So there are some transmission issues that probably prevent you from submitting the tag by 10 a.m. So if by 3 p.m. you cannot submit tag, then probably you're looking for resources and transmission. So that's not expected. If I'm load, I rely on that source, and I would consider not to deal with this marketer in the future or talk to the marketer that this is not what I expect. So that's just a mechanical problem. Now, how do you model your system? Maybe you can use a different way to model your system to get that information in a different way instead of relying on tag. There is a inter-assay trade in the ISO. So if there is a generator that's involved in a bilateral deal, the generator will get paid twice from the bilateral market and from the ISO. In order to solve that problem, today the ISO has an inter-assay trade. So this problem, I don't know how you want to deal with this problem. This may be a problem in other BAAs too, when you expand ISO footprint to involve other BAAs. And this inter-assay trade is submitted together with the day-ahead bid before 10 a.m. So even transmission is not available. People may know where the source is, where the sink is, so they can submit this inter-assay trade and to prevent this double charging and double payment. So using this inter-assay trade, that may give ISO some information by 10 a.m. So at least which BAA it is from, or which generation trading hub it is, even though you may not know exactly which generator. So I don't know if I explained myself clearly. So that's my thoughts. So I'm going to share with you.
Yeah, I think I heard talking that you think kind of the inter-SC trade functionality could also be leveraged to try to more accurately model these because it gives some information. So I think that's a fair point.
Any other questions?
I do not see any other callers in the queue as of now.
Okay. I think we can move on to next steps. All right, so tomorrow we will have an earlier start. We'll start at 8 a.m. Like I mentioned at the beginning of today's workshop, we will be having continental breakfast available to you starting at 7 a.m. So you're welcome to come and take advantage of that. And then tomorrow's workshop will focus again on day-ahead RSE, and we'll cover the failure consequences framework and the pooled WEIM RSE concept. And then on this slide, I also have the schedule of the remaining EDM technical workshops for the month. So we'll have 2 virtual ones next week. So those will focus on transmission and then transfer revenue and congestion rent allocation. And then we'll have another technical workshop offered as a hybrid format in person and virtual in Salt Lake City, Utah. So if you haven't already registered for that, I encourage you to do so. And that one will focus on confidence in transfers, GHG accounting, and then again, day ahead, RSE and transmission, any lingering topic we have from our workshops we've had previously. And then the 27th will be dedicated to GHG accounting. So today we'd like to conclude with a networking reception. So I encourage you to stick around and join us for that here at the Marriott. We'll be just out on the trellis outside by the pool, and we'll have some appetizers and things like that. So we hope that you'll join us for that. And then lastly, I just want to give a reminder that we will be hosting the Stakeholder Symposium at the Safe Credit Union Convention Center this year in downtown Sacramento on November 9th and 10th. And registration for that event is now open. So I encourage you to register for the symposium as well. But if you have any questions related to the symposium, you can send an email to symposiumreg@kaiso.com, which is on this slide. So that wraps up today. I'm going to hand it over to Milos or Mark for any closing remarks. Okay. That wraps it up. Then thank you all for joining us, and we'll see you bright and early tomorrow.